Welcome, dear listener, to another gentle journey through the shadows of history. Tonight, we invite you to settle back, perhaps pull a soft blanket closer, and allow your mind to drift into the cobblestone streets and timber-framed houses of centuries past. You are safe here, in your comfortable present, wrapped in the certainty of modern law and financial protection, as we explore a time when debt was not merely a number on a statement, but a chain that could bind you in ways both literal and profound. Please consider subscribing to the channel and drop a comment below. In the year 1400, as autumn mists rolled across the countryside of medieval Europe, the concept of debt carried weight that extended far beyond simple monetary obligation. Imagine yourself in this world where a single unpaid sum could transform a free person into something resembling property, where the line between debtor and prisoner blurred into a gray expanse of legal ambiguity and social disgrace. The air itself seemed heavier then, thick with the scent of wood smoke and the unspoken fears of those who lived perpetually on the edge of financial ruin. Tonight, we shall walk together through the daily existence of those caught in debt's unforgiving web. We will explore the mechanisms that transformed ordinary people into prisoners, witness the grinding routine of debtors' confinement, and understand how society itself was shaped by these ancient chains of obligation. Let your breathing slow as we step into this forgotten world, where the simple act of borrowing grain or coin could lead to a life forever changed. The rhythm of medieval life beat to the constant pulse of transaction and obligation, creating a web of interdependence that bound communities together while simultaneously threatening to tear individuals apart. Rest now and prepare to journey into a time when your word was your bond and your freedom hung in the balance of every promise made. Picture yourself awakening in the pre-dawn darkness of a medieval morning, not in your own humble dwelling, but within the cold stone walls of a debtor's prison. The year is 1400, and you are among the countless souls whose financial obligations have transformed them from free citizens into something approaching chattel. The thick walls around you echo with the soft murmurs of other unfortunates, their breath visible in the chill air as they stir from restless sleep on beds of straw. The morning routine begins before the cocks crow, as it has for countless generations of the imprisoned. You rise from your thin pallet, feeling the dampness that perpetually clings to these ancient stones, and join the shuffling procession of your fellow debtors. The guard's heavy footsteps echo down the corridor, announcing the start of another day in this liminal existence between freedom and true imprisonment. Unlike common criminals, you retain certain privileges, yet these feel hollow when weighed against your lost liberty. Your debt begins simply enough, as most did in this age of uncertainty. Perhaps it was grain borrowed during a lean harvest when the previous year's crops had rotted in unusually wet fields. Or maybe it was coin borrowed to pay your lord's taxes when the wool from your sheep had fetched less than expected at the autumn fair. The specifics matter little now. What matters is that the sum grew, as debts invariably did, compounding with interest and fees until it became a living thing that consumed your future. In this world of 1400, debt was not merely a financial arrangement, but a secret bond that tied your very soul to your creditor. The church taught that a man's word was his secret vow before God, and breaking such a vow carried consequences both temporal and eternal. Society reinforced this belief through laws that made debtors responsible not just with their possessions, but with their bodies, their labor, and their freedom. The morning air carries the scent of porridge being prepared in the prison's kitchen, a thin gruel that will sustain you for another day of contemplating your obligations. As you move through your morning ablutions, the reality of your situation settles around you like a familiar cloak.
Unlike the violent criminals housed in the darker reaches of the prison, you and your fellow debtors occupy a strange middle ground in the medieval hierarchy of punishment. You are not here because you have committed a crime against person or property, but because you have failed to honor the complex web of obligation that held society together. Your crime, if it can be called that, was the inability to transform your promises into coin. The other debtors around you represent a cross-section of medieval society's middle ranks. There is Master Thomas, once a prosperous baker whose business crumbled when a fire destroyed his ovens and his ability to repay the money borrowed for their construction. His hands, still bearing the calluses of his trade, now work at simple tasks assigned by the prison keeper. Beside him sits Geoffrey, a minor merchant whose ventures in wool trading came to ruin when a shipment was lost to bandits on the road to London. Each carries their story like a burden, and in the quiet moments of the morning, these tales emerge in whispered conversations. You learn that debt imprisonment was not random misfortune, but a systemic feature of medieval economic life. The majority of those around you were once productive members of society, craftsmen and traders whose only failing was trusting in fortune's continued favor. Their presence here serves as a reminder to the wider community of the consequences of financial overreach. The prison itself reflects the peculiar nature of debt imprisonment. While criminals faced dungeons and chains, debtors often found themselves in quarters that, while austere, acknowledged their different status. You sleep in a dormitory-style chamber with wooden beds, not stone floors. You eat simple but adequate food, not the scraps given to murderers and thieves. Most importantly, you retain the possibility of redemption through the payment of your debt, a hope that keeps you tethered to the world of the free. As the morning progresses, you join the daily labor that all able-bodied debtors must perform. This work serves multiple purposes in the medieval mind.
It partially offsets the cost of your maintenance, provides a means of gradual debt reduction, and prevents the moral corruption that idle hands were believed to invite. Today, like most days, you find yourself in the prison workshop, where debtors engage in various trades under the watchful eye of appointed supervisors. The work varies according to season and need. In autumn, you might find yourself processing wool, combing and cleaning the rough fibers that will eventually become cloth. The rhythmic motion of the combs becomes meditative, allowing your mind to wander while your hands perform the familiar motions. The wool dust floats in the shafts of sunlight that penetrate the workshop's high windows, creating an almost ethereal atmosphere that softens the harsh reality of your circumstances. During winter months, the work shifts to indoor tasks, better suited to the shortened days and bitter cold. You might find yourself copying documents for the prison's clerks, your ability to read and write marking you as valuable despite your reduced circumstances. The scratch of quill and parchment provides a steady rhythm to the passing hours, while the scent of ink and the feel of vellum under your fingers connects you to the wider world of commerce and learning that once was your domain. The value of your labor is carefully recorded by the prison's clerks, men whose meticulous bookkeeping determines the slow pace of your potential redemption. Each day's work reduces your debt by a predetermined amount, though this sum is invariably small compared to the total you owe. The arithmetic of freedom becomes a constant mental exercise as you calculate how many more days, weeks, or years your current pace of work will require to secure your release. Meal times bring a different rhythm to the day, marked not by abundance, but by the quiet satisfaction of shared hardship. The midday meal typically consists of brown bread, perhaps a thin soup made from vegetables and bones, an ale that is more water than grain. You eat in the common hall with your fellow debtors, conversations flowing around the wooden tables as men share news, complaints, and the occasional joke that brightens the monotonous routine. These meals become social anchors in a life otherwise stripped of normal human connections. You learn about conditions in the outside world from newly arrived debtors, hearing news of harvests, of political developments, of the shifting fortunes of trade that once concerned you so directly. Sometimes wives or family members are permitted to visit, bringing small luxuries, a piece of fruit, news from home, or simply the comfort of familiar faces in an alien environment. The afternoon hours often find you in the prison yard, an enclosed courtyard where debtors can exercise and breathe fresh air under the watchful eyes of guards. The yard serves as both privilege and reminder of your confinement. its high walls blocking your view of the free world beyond, while allowing enough space to stretch limbs cramped from workshop labor. Here, the seasonal changes become more apparent as you watch clouds drift overhead and feel the shifting temperature of the air against your skin. In this space, informal schools of knowledge develop among the debtors. Men share the skills of their former trades, teaching each other techniques that might prove useful either within the prison or hopefully in their eventual return to freedom. You might learn the basics of metalworking from a former blacksmith, or gain insight into the wool trade from a merchant whose knowledge remains valuable even in reduced circumstances. These exchanges create bonds of mutual support that help ease the psychological burden of confinement. The evening brings a different quality to prison life as the day's work ends and the long hours until sleep must be filled with quieter activities. Some debtors spend this time in prayer, seeking divine intervention for their earthly troubles. Others engage in games of chance, using carved wooden pieces or marked stones, gambling with the few personal possessions they've managed to retain. Still others simply sit in contemplation, perhaps composing letters in their minds to family members they cannot contact. As darkness settles over the prison and the guards begin their nightly rounds, you return to your sleeping chamber. The straw of your mattress has been compressed by use into a barely adequate cushion, but it represents a kind of luxury compared to the conditions faced by common criminals. You pull your thin blanket close and listen to the sounds of the prison settling into night. The creak of old wood, the distant voices of guards, and the soft murmurs of other debtors finding their own accommodation with sleep. Before sleep claims you, your mind inevitably turns to the calculations that have become central to your existence. How much did today's labor reduce your debt? How many more days will be required at this pace? What news might come tomorrow from the outside world that could change your circumstances? These questions circle through your consciousness like a familiar prayer, part hope and part resignation, as you drift toward whatever dreams visit those who sleep in the shadow of unpaid obligation. The dawn of your second week in confinement brings with it a deeper understanding of the intricate legal machinery that has ensnared you. As you break your fast with the same thin porridge that has become routine, you begin to comprehend how this seemingly simple act of borrowing money in the year 1400 could lead to such complete loss of freedom. The mechanisms of debt imprisonment were not arbitrary cruelties, but carefully constructed legal instruments, woven into the very fabric of medieval society with the precision of a master weaver's cloth. Your education in these matters comes from unexpected sources. Master William, an elderly man who has occupied the cell beside yours for nearly 3 years, possesses an intimate knowledge of debt law that rivals any learned clerk. His own imprisonment stems from a complex web of guarantees and sureties that collapsed when his business partner fled the realm, leaving William responsible for debts he never directly incurred.
In the quiet hours after evening meal, he shares his hard-won wisdom about the legal principles that govern your shared fate. The foundation of debt imprisonment rested upon an ancient concept known as mean process, a legal mechanism that allowed creditors to seize the person of their debtor when other means of recovery proved insufficient. Unlike common criminals who were imprisoned as punishment for their crimes, you and your fellow debtors were held as security for your obligations. Your body, in the eyes of medieval law, served as collateral for your unpaid debts, a living guarantee that could be confined until the obligation was satisfied. The process that brought you here began months before your actual arrest, with a series of legal steps as formal and ritualized as any religious ceremony. First came the initial demand for payment, delivered by a court official who read the writ in the presence of witnesses. This document, written in the flowing Latin script that marked all serious legal proceedings, gave you a specific period to satisfy your debt or present yourself before a magistrate to explain your inability to pay. When that deadline passed unmet, as it inevitably did for those lacking sufficient means, the next phase of the legal machinery engaged. Your creditor petitioned the court for a writ of capias ad satisfaciendum, literally meaning take him to satisfy. This document authorized the sheriff or his appointed bailiffs to seize your person and hold you until the debt could be resolved.
The language of these writs was precise and unforgiving, describing you not as a person who owed money, but as one who had withdrawn himself from justice and must therefore be compelled to answer for his obligations. The actual moment of your arrest remains vivid in your memory, replaying itself in the quiet moments before sleep. The bailiff arrived at your workshop on a Tuesday morning, bearing the official seal that transformed you from free citizen to debtor in bondage. There was no violence, no struggle, merely the reading of the writ and the expectation that you would come quietly.
Resistance would have been futile and would only have added additional charges to your growing burden of obligation. The walk to the debtor's prison took you through streets you had known all your life, but which now seemed foreign and strange. Neighbors watched from doorways and windows, some with sympathy, others with the barely concealed satisfaction of those who had avoided a similar fate. Children followed for a few yards before being called back by anxious parents who understood that today's observer might become tomorrow's prisoner. The weight of public shame added another layer to your burden, transforming what had been a private financial difficulty into a public demonstration of failure. Upon arrival at the prison, you encountered another layer of the legal machinery that would govern your confinement. The prison keeper, a man whose authority derived from ancient custom rather than royal appointment, possessed wide discretion in how he managed his charges. His records, carefully maintained in ledger books, whose pages bore the names of hundreds who had passed through these walls, would determine not only your daily routine, but also the pace of your potential release. The fees and charges associated with imprisonment created their own complex economy within the prison walls. Your creditor was required to pay a weekly sum for your maintenance, typically 4 pence per week, though this amount varied according to local custom and the prisoner's social standing. This payment covered your basic sustenance, the bread, ale, and occasional vegetables that kept you alive, but any comfort beyond mere survival required additional expenditure. The paradox of debt imprisonment became clear in these financial arrangements. Your creditor, seeking satisfaction for money owed, found himself paying additional sums to maintain you in confinement. Some creditors, faced with mounting maintenance costs, eventually forgave portions of the original debt rather than continue the weekly payments indefinitely. Others, particularly those with deep purses and strong principles about the sanctity of contractual obligations, were prepared to maintain debtors for years, rather than accept any reduction in what they considered their rightful due. Your own creditor, Master Robert the grain merchant, visited the prison once during your second week of confinement. The meeting took place in the small chamber reserved for such discussions, under the watchful eye of the prison keeper, who served as witness to any agreements reached. Robert's face bore the pinched expression of a man paying twice for the same commodity, once in the original debt and again in your maintenance costs. The conversation revealed the emotional complexity that often accompanied these business relationships. Robert had known your family for 2 decades and watched your children grow, had shared ale with you at harvest celebrations. Yet business was business, and the grain you had taken on credit during the failed harvest represented not just money, but his own obligations to suppliers and creditors. His decision to pursue imprisonment was not personal vindictiveness, but economic necessity, the only means available to demonstrate to his other debtors that obligations must be honored. The legal system provided several mechanisms for resolving debt imprisonment, though each carried its own complexities and potential pitfalls. The most straightforward was complete payment of the debt, including accumulated interest and prison fees. For those possessing hidden resources or expecting inheritance or business income, this remained a viable option. However, most debtors found themselves in prison precisely because such resources were unavailable. A second option involved negotiating a composition with creditors, agreeing to pay a reduced sum in exchange for immediate release. These negotiations required delicate balancing of competing interests, as accepting less than full payment might encourage other debtors to default in hopes of similar reductions. Your fellow prisoner Jeffrey had attempted such negotiations with his wool merchant creditors, offering to pay 60% of his debts in exchange for freedom to resume trading. The merchants, however, demanded 80% and additional security, negotiations that had continued for months without resolution. The most complex mechanism involved the assignment of future earnings to creditor satisfaction.
Under this arrangement, a debtor might secure release by pledging to turn over all income above basic subsistence to debt payment for a specified period. Master Thomas had accepted such terms, agreeing to work as a journeyman baker for 7 years while paying half his wages to his creditors. The psychological burden of such arrangements often proved as heavy as physical imprisonment, binding men to years of reduced circumstances and constant oversight. Some debtors sought relief through ecclesiastical intervention, appealing at religious authorities who possessed moral authority over both debtors and creditors. The church taught that excessive interest and harsh treatment of debtors constituted sins against Christian charity, though these teachings were often honored more in principle than practice. Successful appeals typically require demonstrating that the debt had been incurred through no fault of the debtor, such as losses due to natural disasters, warfare, or the dishonesty of business partners. The seasonal rhythm of debt imprisonment reflected the agricultural cycle that dominated medieval economic life. Spring brought the promise of new crops and renewed economic activity, often leading to increased negotiations as creditors became more willing to accept reduced settlements in hopes of benefiting from the debtor's future productivity. Summer saw the arrival of harvest-related debtors, men whose optimistic borrowing against expected crops had been disappointed by weather, disease, or market conditions. Autumn typically brought a wave of releases, as successful harvests provided the means to settle outstanding obligations. The sight of former cellmates departing with their few possessions created a complex mixture of joy and envy among those who remained. Winter was the harshest season for debt prisoners, as economic activity slowed and the prospects for release diminished. The cold months became a test of endurance, both physical and psychological, as men struggled to maintain hope through the longest nights of the year. Your own case carried particular complexities that made release more challenging than simple payment might suggest. The original debt for grain had been compounded by your inability to plant the following season's crop due to illness.
This created a cascade of secondary obligations, unpaid rent to your landlord, taxes owed to the manor court, and additional borrowing to feed your family during your confinement. What had begun as a debt of 12 shillings had grown to nearly £2, a sum that would require years of labor to satisfy. The prison keeper's ledgers told similar stories of compound obligation, where initial debts became self-perpetuating cycles of financial bondage. Interest calculations followed medieval mathematical principles that often favored creditors, with compound interest applied to maintenance costs as well as original debts. The result was that many debtors found their obligations growing faster than their ability to reduce them through prison labor, creating a form of financial quicksand from which escape became increasingly difficult. As you settle into your sleeping pallet at the end of another day spent understanding the machinery of your confinement, the complexity of medieval debt law spreads before you like a vast tapestry. Each thread represents another legal principle, another precedent, another mechanism that has contributed to your current circumstances. The system, you realized, was not designed with malicious intent, but emerged from centuries of attempting to balance competing needs: the creditor's right to satisfaction, the debtor's need for survival, and society's interest in maintaining both commercial confidence and social stability. Your third week in the debtor's prison brings a profound revelation about the true nature of medieval society, as you begin to understand that your individual predicament is merely one strand in an enormous web of interconnected obligations that binds every person, from the lowest serf to the highest nobleman. The morning light filtering through the barred windows illuminates not just the stone walls of your confinement, but the invisible threads of mutual dependence that have shaped human relationships for centuries beyond memory. This understanding emerges gradually through conversations with your fellow prisoners, each of whom carries their own piece of the larger puzzle.
Master Edmund, a former wool merchant whose confinement began 6 months ago, possesses an almost encyclopedic knowledge of the commercial relationships that tied together the medieval world.
His days are spent in careful documentation of these connections, creating detailed maps of obligation that reveal the true complexity of the system that has ensnared you all. The foundation of this web rests upon the feudal principle that all land ultimately belongs to the king, granted downward through an intricate hierarchy of lords, knights, and tenants. Each level of this hierarchy carries both privileges and obligations, creating chains of mutual dependence that extend from the royal court to the humblest peasant cottage. Your own position as a freeman who rented land placed you within this system, subject to obligations that extended far beyond simple monetary payment. Your landlord, Sir Geoffrey de Montfort, held his manor through service to Earl William, who in turn held his lands through obligation to the king. Each level of this hierarchy required its occupants to provide specific services or payments, creating a cascade of financial pressure that ultimately flowed downward to those least able to bear it. When the king demanded extraordinary taxation to fund military campaigns, the pressure transmitted throughout each level of society until it reached men like you, struggling to pay both rent and taxes from the uncertain proceeds of agricultural labor. The seasonal cycle of obligation created its own rhythm of financial stress throughout the medieval world. Spring brought the need for seed grain and implements, requiring borrowing against future harvests. Summer demanded labor costs and maintenance of tools and buildings, often necessitating additional credit arrangements. Autumn brought the moment of reckoning, when harvest yields determined whether the year's accumulated obligations could be satisfied. Winter imposed its own burdens, as households required fuel, preserved food, and warm clothing to survive until the cycle began anew. Your fellow prisoner Martin provides a vivid illustration of how these seasonal pressures could compound into disaster. A carpenter by trade, he had borrowed money in early spring to purchase quality timber for a commission from the local abbey. The project required specialized woods that commanded premium prices, but the abbey's payment was delayed by disputes over architectural details.
When autumn arrived, Martin found himself caught between his timber suppliers demanding payment and his abbey patrons withholding settlement until construction met their exacting standards. The delay stretched through winter, during which Martin's family required food and fuel that he could not provide from his own resources. Additional borrowing became necessary, secured against the expectation of eventual payment from the abbey. When spring arrived, the abbey finally accepted the completed work, but paid only 70% of the agreed sum, claiming defects that Martin disputed but lacked the political influence to challenge. The resulting shortfall left him unable to satisfy any of his accumulated debts, leading to his current imprisonment. The role of women in this web of obligation adds another layer of complexity to your understanding of medieval debt relationships. Unlike modern times, when women might own property and enter into contracts independently, the legal system of 1400 generally held that married women's financial obligations merged with those of their husbands. This principle, known as coverture, meant that a man's imprisonment for debt could stem from obligations originally incurred by his wife, while simultaneously leaving her without legal recourse to resolve the situation. Your cellmate Robert's situation illustrates this principle with painful clarity. His wife Agnes had operated a small brewing business, selling ale to local households and travelers. The business required credit arrangements with grain suppliers, equipment makers, and even the local authorities who licensed brewing activities. When Agnes fell ill with a wasting disease, the business collapsed, but the legal obligations remained Robert's responsibility. Agnes's death freed her from earthly suffering, but left Robert bound to debts he had never directly incurred and barely understood. The position of unmarried women in the debt system created different but equally complex challenges. Master Eleanor, a widow who occasionally visited the prison to negotiate with creditors, holding claims against her late husband's estate, possessed legal standing to enter into contracts, but lacked the economic power to honor them effectively. Her husband's death had left her with obligations to his business partners, suppliers, and even former employees who claimed unpaid wages.
The law recognized her right to inherit his assets, but these proved insufficient to cover his liabilities, leaving her in a precarious position between legal responsibility and practical inability. Children occupied their own peculiar place in the web of medieval obligation. While minors could not be held directly responsible for debts, they could inherit both assets and liabilities from deceased parents. This inheritance often came with appointed guardians who possessed broad authority to manage the child's affairs, sometimes leading to situations where adult guardians accumulated debts in the child's name that would become the child's responsibility upon reaching majority. The prison occasionally housed young men whose first taste of adult responsibility involved discovering obligations they had unknowingly inherited years earlier. The church's position within this web of obligation created both opportunities for relief and additional complications. Ecclesiastical authorities preached against usury and excessive interest, providing moral support for debtors facing unreasonable demands. However, religious institutions themselves often served as creditors, lending money for various purposes and expecting repayment with the same rigor as secular lenders. The monastery that held the mortgage on your small plot of land exemplified this contradiction, combining spiritual counsel about the dangers of worldly attachment with practical insistence on timely payment of earthly obligations. Monastic institutions possessed certain advantages in debt collection that secular creditors lacked. Their claims to moral authority could shame debtors into payment when legal pressure failed. Their permanence as institutions meant they could pursue obligations across generations, outlasting individual debtors and their families. Most significantly, their access to ecclesiastical courts provided alternative venues for debt collection that sometimes offered more favorable terms than secular legal systems. The guild system added another dimension to the web of medieval obligation, creating professional associations that bound craftsmen and merchants through complex relationships of mutual support and collective responsibility. Master craftsmen served as guarantors for their apprentices and journeymen, accepting financial responsibility for debts incurred in pursuit of trade training.
Guild members contributed to mutual assistance funds that provided support for widows, orphans, and disabled craftsmen, but these contributions created ongoing financial obligations that persisted regardless of individual economic circumstances. Your brief membership in the local grain merchants guild, before your current difficulties began, provided first-hand experience with these collective obligations. The guild's charter required members to contribute to a common fund used for purchasing bulk commodities, sharing storage facilities, and providing mutual credit during seasonal cash flow difficulties. However, when multiple members faced simultaneous financial problems, the mutual support system could collapse, transforming collective strength into shared vulnerability. International trade relationships extended the web of obligation far beyond local boundaries, connecting English debtors with creditors in Flanders, France, and even distant Italian city-states. The wool trade that dominated English commerce required credit arrangements that might span multiple years and cross several national boundaries. A sheep farmer in Yorkshire might find himself obligated to merchants in Bruges, while English cloth manufacturers carried debts to Flemish weavers and Italian dyers. When these international relationships failed, the resulting defaults could cascade through multiple countries and affect hundreds of individuals. The complexity of international debt relationships often made resolution difficult or impossible. Language barriers complicated negotiations, while different legal systems made enforcement unpredictable. Currency fluctuations could transform profitable arrangements into ruinous obligations overnight, as the relative values of English sterling, Flemish pounds, and Italian florins shifted with political and economic conditions. Some of your fellow prisoners carried debts denominated in foreign currencies, creating the additional burden of exchange rate calculations in their hopes for eventual freedom. The role of Jewish moneylenders in medieval debt relationships occupies a particularly complex position in this web of obligation. Legal restrictions prevented Jews from engaging in most forms of agriculture, crafts, and trade, channeling them toward financial services that Christian doctrine theoretically prohibited. This created a system where Christian borrowers depended upon Jewish lenders for credit, while simultaneously maintaining social and religious barriers that complicated the relationships.
The periodic expulsions of Jewish communities, as occurred in England in 1290, left Christian debtors with obligations to creditors who might no longer be available for negotiation or payment.
The prison's records contain references to debts originally owed to Jewish lenders who had been expelled or had fled persecution decades earlier. These obligations had been transferred to Christian collectors or royal officials, but the original documentation was often incomplete or disputed. Some debtors found themselves imprisoned for sums they claimed had already been paid to the original Jewish creditors, with no way to prove satisfaction to the new holders of their obligations. Political upheaval added another layer of uncertainty to the web of medieval obligation. Wars, rebellions, and changes of royal succession could invalidate existing debt arrangements or create new ones overnight. Taxes imposed to fund military campaigns became debt obligations for those who lacked immediate means of payment. Properties confiscated from political enemies might include claims against debtors who found their obligations transferred to new and potentially hostile creditors. Your own experience includes the burden of extraordinary taxation imposed to fund the king's campaigns in France. The subsidy demanded from your manor required each household to contribute based on assessed wealth, but the assessment occurred before your recent financial difficulties became apparent. The resulting tax obligation, though modest in absolute terms, represented another thread in the web that ultimately led to your current confinement. As the evening meal concludes and you prepare for another night's rest within these stone walls, the full complexity of your situation becomes clear. You are not simply a man who borrowed money and failed to repay it, but rather a single point where multiple threads of medieval obligation intersect and tighten. Your creditor Robert faces his own pressures from suppliers and tax collectors. Your landlord Sir Geoffrey must satisfy his obligations to Earl William. The Earl in turn owes service and payment to the Crown. Each level of this hierarchy creates pressure that ultimately flows downward to individuals like yourself who lack the resources or political power to pass the burden on to others.
The fourth week of your confinement brings an unexpected visitor to the debtor's prison, a man whose presence transforms the quiet routine of your days into something approaching trauma. Master Aldrich de Ashby arrives not as a prisoner but as a creditor, yet his bearing suggests someone who has walked perilously close to the edge of financial ruin himself. His story, which unfolds over several visits as he negotiates with various debtors, provides a window into the precarious world of medieval commerce and the thin line that separated success from catastrophic failure. Aldrich's tale begins in the prosperous wool-trading town of Ashby, where his family had established themselves as merchants of modest but growing reputation during the late 14th century. His father, Master Geoffrey de Ashby, had built their fortune through careful attention to quality and the cultivation of relationships with Flemish cloth manufacturers who prized English wool above all others. The family's warehouse stood prominently on the town's main thoroughfare, its sturdy timber construction and iron-reinforced doors announcing their prosperity to all who passed. The young Aldrich had been groomed for commercial success from his earliest years, learning to assess wool quality by touch and sight before he could properly read Latin script. His education combined practical knowledge of trade with the literacy necessary for maintaining accounts and correspondence with distant partners. By the age of 16, he could evaluate a fleece's potential value within moments of handling it, distinguish between the products of different regions by subtle variations in texture and color, and calculate exchange rates between English sterling and Flemish currency with mathematical precision. The foundation of the family's prosperity rested upon their relationships with a network of sheep farmers scattered across the Yorkshire Dales and the Welsh borders. These relationships, built over decades of fair dealing and prompt payment, provided the Ashby family with access to the finest wools England produced. Master Geoffrey had invested considerable time and effort in cultivating these connections, often traveling difficult roads to visit remote farms and establish personal bonds with their owners.
The trust he built became the family's most valuable asset, more precious than gold or property.
Aldrich's first independent venture, undertaken at the age of 22, demonstrated both his commercial acumen and the dangerous complexity of medieval trade relationships. He had identified an opportunity to supply wool directly to a consortium of Italian textile manufacturers who were willing to pay premium prices for guaranteed quality and regular delivery. The venture required substantial upfront investment to secure exclusive purchasing agreements with selected farmers and arrange for specialized transportation to Mediterranean ports. The initial stages of this enterprise proceeded with remarkable success. Aldrich's careful selection of suppliers ensured that his wool met the exacting standards of Italian buyers, while his attention to packaging and transportation minimized losses during the long journey south. The first year's profits exceeded all expectations, generating sufficient revenue to expand the operation and establish permanent representatives in both London and Bruges. The family's reputation grew accordingly, attracting attention from other merchants who sought partnerships and joint ventures. However, the very success of Aldrich's Italian venture contained the seeds of future difficulties. The substantial profits generated by premium wool sales encouraged him to expand operations rapidly, acquiring exclusive contracts with additional farms and increasing his commitments to Italian buyers. Each expansion required additional capital investment, secured through credit arrangements with London financiers who charged interest rates that reflected both the profitability and risk of international trade. The expansion strategy also required Aldrich to maintain larger inventories of raw wool, awaiting consolidation into shipments large enough to justify the costs of international transportation. These inventories represented significant capital tied up in commodities whose value could fluctuate rapidly based on factors entirely beyond his control. Political tensions between England and France could disrupt shipping routes. Harsh weather might damage stored wool or delay transportation. Changes in Italian fashion preferences could reduce demand for specific types of wool overnight. The complexity of Aldrich's financial arrangements reflected the sophisticated credit mechanisms that had evolved to support international trade.
His operations required multiple types of financing: short-term loans to purchase wool from farmers at harvest time, medium-term credit to maintain inventory during storage and transportation, and long-term arrangements to fund the expansion of facilities and establishment of foreign representatives. Each type of credit carried different interest rates, collateral requirements, and repayment schedules, creating a financial structure of considerable complexity. The first signs of trouble emerged during the harsh winter of 1398, when unusually severe weather disrupted both the collection of wool from remote farms and its transportation to ports. Ships scheduled to carry Aldrich's wool to Italian buyers were delayed for weeks, while the wool itself deteriorated in storage despite his best efforts of preservation. The delayed shipments created a cascade of financial pressures, as Italian buyers withheld payment for inferior goods while English creditors demanded satisfaction according to their original schedules. Aldrich's response to these difficulties demonstrated both his commercial skills and the limitations imposed by medieval financial systems. He negotiated extensions with some creditors while seeking additional credit to cover immediate obligations. He diversified his operations by developing relationships with buyers in Flanders and France, reducing his dependence on Italian markets. Most importantly, he began implementing more conservative inventory policies, reducing the amount of capital tied up in stored commodities. These measures might have succeeded in normal circumstances, but Aldrich's troubles coincided with broader economic disruptions that affected the entire wool trade. Political tensions between England and Scotland led to raids that damaged several of his supplier farms. Currency fluctuations made Italian payments worth less in English money than anticipated. Most significantly, the outbreak of plague in several Italian cities reduced demand for luxury textiles and left some of his buyers unable to honor their commitments. The psychological toll of these mounting difficulties began to affect Aldrich's decision-making in subtle but significant ways. The stress of managing multiple financial crises simultaneously led him to make increasingly desperate attempts to recover his position. He accepted unfavorable terms from new buyers, hoping that quick sales would generate the cash needed to satisfy pressing creditors.
He borrowed money at higher interest rates than his business could sustainably support, gambling that future profits would justify present sacrifices.
One particularly ill-fated decision involved a partnership with Master Simon de Calais, a French merchant who claimed to have exclusive access to wealthy buyers in Paris and the surrounding region. The partnership required Aldrich to advance a substantial quantity of his finest wool to Simon, who promised to return payment within 3 months, plus a share of the exceptional profits he anticipated from French sales. The arrangement violated Aldrich's usual practice of requiring partial payment in advance, but the promised returns seemed to offer a solution to his accumulating financial pressures. The partnership with Simon proved to be Aldrich's downfall. The French merchant proved to be either incompetent or dishonest, possibly both. Months passed without payment or communication, while Aldrich's other creditors grew increasingly demanding. Investigation revealed that Simon had sold the wool but used the proceeds to satisfy his own debts, leaving Aldrich with no recourse except expensive and uncertain legal proceedings in French courts. The loss of both the wool and its expected returns created a financial gap that Aldrich could not bridge through normal commercial operations. The final collapse came with devastating swiftness once Aldrich's creditors lost confidence in his ability to meet obligations. The London financiers, who had provided much of his expansion capital, demanded immediate repayment, threatening to seize his inventory and facilities if satisfaction was not forthcoming. Suppliers who had previously offered generous credit terms insisted on immediate payment for deliveries. Even longtime customers began demanding more favorable terms, sensing weakness and seeking to protect their own interests. Aldrich's attempts to negotiate with his creditors revealed the harsh realities of medieval commercial law. Unlike modern bankruptcy procedures that might allow for reorganization and partial debt relief, medieval law provided few protections for merchants facing financial difficulties. Creditors possessed broad powers to seize assets, and the courts generally favored their claims over the debtor's attempts to maintain operations.
The legal system was designed to ensure payment rather than business continuity, reflecting a fundamental skepticism about commercial enterprises that had grown beyond traditional agricultural and craft activities. The liquidation of Aldrich's business assets provided a cruel lesson in the difference between book value and market reality. The wool inventory that had been valued at premium prices during prosperous times brought only modest sums when sold under pressure. The specialized facilities he had constructed for wool processing and storage proved difficult to sell, as few other merchants required such specific infrastructure. Even his carefully cultivated relationships with farmers and buyers had little value in a forced sale, as these connections depended on personal trust that could not be easily transferred. The personal cost of Aldrich's financial collapse extended far beyond mere monetary loss. His reputation, built over decades of careful business practice, disappeared overnight as news of his difficulties spread through the merchant community. Former friends and associates avoided him, fearful that association with a failed merchant might damage their own standing. His family faced social ostracism as well as financial hardship, finding themselves excluded from the social circles that had once welcomed them warmly. The emotional toll of this transition from prosperity to ruin manifested in ways that affected Aldrich's health and judgment. The stress of constant negotiation with hostile creditors, combined with the shame of public failure, led to periods of deep melancholy that interfered with his ability to think clearly about his remaining options. Sleep became elusive, as his mind repeatedly examined past decisions, searching for the moment when different choices might have prevented the catastrophe. The physical symptoms of prolonged stress, headaches, digestive problems, and a persistent tremor in his hands marked his appearance as clearly as any external sign of poverty. Despite the completeness of his business failure, Aldrich's knowledge and experience retained some value in the medieval commercial world. His understanding of wool quality and international trade relationships made him valuable as an advisor to other merchants, though his reputation limited his opportunities to formal employment rather than independent ventures.
He found work as an agent for a London trading house, using his expertise to evaluate potential investments and negotiate with suppliers on behalf of more cautious principals. This new role brought Aldrich to the debtor's prison as a representative of creditors seeking to recover loans made to imprisoned merchants. The irony of his position was not lost on him. A man who had once faced similar financial pressures, now working to extract payment from others caught in debt's web. His negotiations with the imprisoned debtors reflected a complex mixture of professional necessity and personal sympathy, as he understood their circumstances from painful experience while remaining obligated to pursue his employer's interests. The conversations between Aldrich and the imprisoned debtors provided insights into the broader patterns of commercial failure in medieval society. Many of the stories he heard echoed elements of his own experience: expansion beyond sustainable limits, dependence on unreliable partners, exposure to risks beyond any individual's control. The prevalence of such stories suggested that business failure was not primarily a matter of individual incompetence, but rather a systemic feature of an economic system that offered great rewards to successful risk-takers while providing little protection for those whose ventures failed. Aldrich's presence in the prison coincides with discussions of events that had reshaped the entire landscape of medieval debt and obligation just 3 years earlier. The Great Default of 1397, as it came to be known among merchants and chroniclers, represented a watershed moment when the traditional assumption that royal obligations would always be honored crumbled beneath the weight of political upheaval and financial overextension. The reverberations of that crisis continue to shape the circumstances that have brought you and your fellow debtors to this place of confinement. The origins of the crisis stretched back to the ambitious military campaigns that had characterized English foreign policy throughout the late 14th century. King Richard II, young and eager to establish his martial reputation, had committed the realm to expensive expeditions in Scotland, Ireland, and France simultaneously.
Each campaign required substantial upfront investment in men, weapons, and supplies, and transportation, creating financial obligations that far exceeded the crown's regular income from feudal dues and customary taxes. To finance these military ventures, the royal treasury had developed increasingly sophisticated relationships with merchant bankers, both English and foreign, who possessed the liquid capital necessary to fund immediate military needs. The most prominent of these relationships involved the Medici Bank of Florence, whose representatives had established permanent offices in London, specifically to manage English royal accounts. The Italian bankers brought not only capital, but also financial techniques that were revolutionary in their complexity and scale. Master Francesco de Marco de Tini, the Medici representative who negotiated the largest royal loans, had established his residence in a grand house near the Tower of London, from which he managed financial operations that spanned multiple countries and currencies. His offices employed dozens of clerks who maintained meticulous records of transactions, exchange rates, and payment schedules using double-entry bookkeeping methods that were still novel in Northern Europe. The scale of these operations dwarfed anything previously seen in English commercial life. The royal borrowing arrangements reflected a level of financial sophistication that pushed medieval credit systems to their absolute limits. Simple loans secured by specific revenues evolved into complex instruments that pledged future tax collections, customs duties, and even the theoretical proceeds of military conquests not yet undertaken. Some agreements included provisions for payment in alternative currencies if English sterling depreciated, while others incorporated elaborate penalty clauses designed to protect lenders against various forms of political and economic risk. The Medici Bank's willingness to extend such substantial credit to the English crown rested upon their assessment of the kingdom's fundamental wealth and political stability. England's wool exports provided a reliable source of foreign currency, while the realm's political institutions appeared stable enough to honor long-term obligations. Most importantly, the medieval principle that royal debts passed to successors provided assurance that individual kings' deaths would not void outstanding obligations. These factors combined to make English royal credit seem as solid as any available in medieval Europe.
However, the complexity of these financial arrangements created vulnerabilities that neither lenders nor borrowers fully understood. The interconnected nature of medieval finance meant that difficulties in one area could rapidly spread to affect entirely separate transactions. When Scottish military campaigns proved more expensive and less successful than anticipated, the resulting financial strain affected the crown's ability to meet obligations related to completely different French expeditions. Currency fluctuations that benefit some agreements simultaneously damaged others, creating accounting nightmares for royal treasurers. The first serious warning signs emerged during the summer of 1396, when a particularly expensive siege in Ireland consumed far more resources than budgeted while producing no corresponding territorial gains. The failure forced the royal treasury to request extensions on several major loan repayments, citing temporary cash flow difficulties that would supposedly resolve once autumn tax collections were completed. The Medici Bank agreed to these extensions but began charging penalty interest rates that significantly increased the ultimate cost of the delayed payments. Simultaneously, domestic political tensions began affecting the crown's ability to collect the taxes upon which its credit arrangements depended. Lords who had previously remitted royal taxes with reasonable promptness began withholding payments as leverage in various political disputes. The complex web of feudal obligations that theoretically ensured regular revenue flow proved vulnerable to political manipulation by nobles who possessed sufficient local power to resist royal collection efforts. The crisis deepened throughout the autumn of 1396, as it became apparent that tax collections would fall significantly short of projections used to justify earlier borrowing. The shortfall was not merely a matter of reduced economic activity, but reflected active resistance by political opponents who had identified royal finances as a point of vulnerability. Lords who disagreed with the king's military priorities, his choice of advisors, or his domestic policies discovered that withholding tax payments provided effective leverage without the overt treason involved in military rebellion. Master Francesco's position became increasingly precarious as reports from his network of agents revealed the true extent of English financial difficulties.
The Francesco's own reputation with the Medici hierarchy in Florence depended upon the accuracy of his assessments of English creditworthiness, while his substantial personal investment in English ventures meant that any major default would threaten his own financial survival. The letters he exchanged with his superiors during this period, some of which later became public during legal proceedings, revealed a man caught between professional obligations and personal fears. The breaking point came in February 1397. When King Richard's treasury formally notified the Medici Bank that several major loan payments would be indefinitely delayed pending resolution of domestic political difficulties. The notification, delivered by an embarrassed royal clerk who clearly understood the implications of his message, marked the first time in living memory that the English crown had explicitly acknowledged its inability to meet foreign financial obligations. The precedent sent shockwaves through European financial markets that extended far beyond the immediate parties involved. The Medici Bank's response demonstrated both the sophistication of medieval financial instruments and their ultimate dependence upon political relationships that could shift unpredictably. Rather than simply absorbing the losses or pursuing immediate legal remedies, Francesco attempted to negotiate a complex restructuring that would have converted portions of the defaulted debt into long-term obligations secured by specific English revenues. The proposal included provisions for Medici agents to directly collect customs duties at English ports, effectively placing portions of royal revenue under foreign control. These negotiations revealed fundamental tensions between medieval concepts of royal sovereignty and the practical requirements of international finance. English nobles who had previously shown little interest in the technical details of royal borrowing suddenly became intensely concerned when foreign creditors proposed to collect English taxes directly. The political implications of allowing Italian bankers to control English customs houses sparked debates that reached far beyond financial circles to encompass questions of national dignity and independence. The failure of the restructuring negotiations forced more dramatic measures that ultimately reshaped English financial policy for decades to come.
In March 1397, King Richard issued a formal decree repudiating major portions of his foreign debts, citing both his inability to pay and his unwillingness to compromise English sovereignty through the concessions demanded by creditors. The repudiation was carefully crafted to distinguish between domestic and foreign obligations, honoring debts to English creditors while defaulting on those owed to foreigners. The immediate consequences of the royal default extended far beyond the specific creditors involved. European merchant bankers who had previously viewed English credit as reliable suddenly reassessed their exposure to English risks, withdrawing from pending transactions and demanding additional security for ongoing relationships. The flow of foreign capital that had supported English commercial expansion slowed dramatically, forcing merchants throughout the realm to rely more heavily on domestic financing sources that lacked the sophistication and scale of international alternatives. Uldrich's own business difficulties had been significantly exacerbated by these broader financial disruptions. His relationships with Italian buyers depended partly upon credit arrangements facilitated by the same banking networks that had suffered losses from the royal default. When these banks became reluctant to finance English trade, the entire structure of international wool commerce shifted in ways that disadvantaged merchants who had built their businesses around the previous system's assumptions. The social and political consequences of the Great Default proved even more significant than its immediate financial effects. The spectacle of the English crown formally acknowledging its inability to honor obligations undermined confidence in the stability of medieval institutions more broadly. If kings could not be trusted to pay their debts, what assurance did ordinary citizens have that any promises or agreements would be honored? The crisis contributed to a broader erosion of social trust that manifested in various forms of political and economic instability. The legal precedents established by the royal default created ongoing complications for debt relationships at every level of society. Creditors who had previously relied upon the assumption that debts would ultimately be honored began demanding additional security and higher interest rates to compensate for newly recognized risks.
The resulting increase in the cost of credit affected not only major merchants and nobles, but also ordinary farmers and craftsmen who depended upon seasonal borrowing to manage their operations. The international diplomatic consequences of the default proved remarkably durable, affecting English relationships with European powers for years after the immediate crisis had passed. Foreign governments that had previously maintained cordial commercial relationships with England began imposing additional restrictions and requirements on English merchants operating within their territories. The reputation for financial reliability that English traders had built over decades disappeared virtually overnight, replaced by suspicion and demands for additional guarantees. The Crown's attempt to rebuild its financial credibility following the default required painful adjustments that affected the entire realm. New taxes imposed to demonstrate the government's commitment to honoring obligations fell most heavily upon those least able to bear additional burdens. The very farmers and merchants whose economic difficulties had contributed to the original crisis found themselves facing increased tax obligations at precisely the moment when their own financial resources were most strained. The debtors' prison population swelled with men whose failures reflected not personal inadequacy, but their exposure to systemic financial disruptions beyond any individual's control. Master Francesco's eventual departure from England in late 1397 marked the end of an era in English international finance. His grand house near the Tower was sold to satisfy debts he could no longer collect, while his sophisticated accounting methods were abandoned in favor of simpler systems that reflected reduced commercial ambitions. The dozens of clerks who had once managed complex international transactions found employment in humbler positions, their specialized skills no longer relevant to England's reduced circumstances. The lessons of the Great Default continue to influence financial relationships throughout Europe long after the immediate crisis had passed.
Lenders became more cautious about extending credit to political entities, while borrowers found themselves subject to more stringent requirements and oversight. The optimistic assumption that economic growth would continue indefinitely, enabling ever larger debts to be serviced from future prosperity, gave way to more conservative approaches that emphasized current ability to pay over future potential. As Aldrich concludes his negotiations with various debtors and prepares to return to London with what modest recoveries he has managed, his presence serves as a reminder of how individual financial difficulties connect to broader historical currents. Your own imprisonment, while arising from apparently personal circumstances, occurs within the context of systemic changes that have made credit more difficult to obtain and debts harder to service. The Great Default of 1397 may seem distant from your daily concerns about prison labor and debt reduction, but its effects continue to shape the economic environment that determines your prospects for eventual freedom. The departure of Master Aldrich from the debtor's prison leaves behind more than just the echo of his footsteps in the stone corridors. His visit has illuminated connections between individual financial ruin and the broader currents of history that flow through medieval society like underground rivers, sometimes invisible but always present, shaping the landscape in ways that only become apparent when viewed from the proper perspective. As autumn deepens into winter during your 5th week of confinement, the implications of these connections become increasingly clear through the stories shared by your fellow prisoners and the observations of those who have witnessed the changing nature of debt and obligation over the span of their lifetimes. Master William, the elderly debtor whose knowledge of legal principles has proved so valuable, reveals that his own family's history provides a living chronicle of how debt relationships have evolved over the past century. His grandfather, also named William, had conducted business during the reign of Edward III, when royal financial obligations were generally honored and international trade relationships operated according to well-established customs that provided reasonable predictability for merchants and creditors alike.
The elder William's ledgers, carefully preserved despite the family's reduced circumstances, document a world where credit arrangements were simpler, interest rates were lower, and the risks of international commerce, while always present, operated within boundaries that experienced merchants could anticipate and manage. The transformation from that earlier era to the present circumstances represents more than mere economic evolution. It reflects fundamental changes in the relationship between political authority and commercial activity. During the 1330s and 1340s, when Master William's grandfather conducted his most successful operations, royal policy actively encouraged international trade through favorable customs arrangements, diplomatic protection for merchant interests, and consistent legal frameworks that provided reliable recourse for commercial disputes. The Crown understood that prosperous merchants generated tax revenues that supported royal ambitions, creating a mutually beneficial relationship that encouraged both commercial expansion and political stability. The gradual erosion of this symbiotic relationship began with the military pressures of the 1360s and 1370s, when extended campaigns in France required ever larger financial resources that strained traditional revenue sources.
Kings who had previously viewed merchants as partners in generating prosperity increasingly saw them as sources of emergency funding for military ventures that promised glory but delivered mounting debts. This shift in royal perspective from long-term partnership to short-term exploitation created an atmosphere of uncertainty that made merchants increasingly cautious about large-scale ventures. Master William's own father, conducting business during this transitional period, had experienced firsthand the effects of changing royal attitudes toward commercial relationships. A successful grain merchant who had built strong relationships with agricultural producers throughout Yorkshire and Lincolnshire, the elder William found his operations increasingly disrupted by arbitrary royal demands for loans, contributions to military campaigns, and compliance with trade restrictions designed to benefit royal favorites rather than promote general commercial prosperity. The predictable business environment that had enabled his father's success gave way to a volatile situation where political considerations could override commercial logic overnight. The personal correspondence preserved in the family's archives reveals the psychological toll that these changing conditions imposed upon merchants who had built their careers around assumptions of political stability and commercial predictability.
Letters exchanged between Master William's father and his business partners document a gradual shift from optimistic expansion plans to defensive strategies focused on protecting existing assets rather than developing new opportunities. The confident tone of earlier correspondence gives way to expressions of concern about political developments, currency fluctuations, and the reliability of traditional business relationships. One particularly revealing letter, written by Master William's father to a Flemish wool buyer in 1378, expresses frustration with the increasing complexity of international trade relationships that had once been straightforward. Where previous generations of merchants had conducted business based on established customs and mutual trust, the political upheavals of the late 14th century required elaborate contractual protections, guarantees from multiple parties, and contingency plans for various forms of political and economic disruption. The additional complexity not only increased the cost of conducting business, but also created numerous opportunities for disputes and misunderstandings that could lead to commercial relationships breaking down entirely. The effects of these broader changes manifested in the experiences of individual debtors whose circumstances paralleled your own situation. Master Thomas, the baker whose fire-damaged ovens had led to his current imprisonment, represents a category of debtors whose difficulties stemmed from the increased cost and reduced availability of credit following the financial disruptions of the 1990s. During his father's generation, a craftsman facing unexpected equipment losses could typically obtain replacement financing from local sources at reasonable interest rates, secured by his established reputation and future earning potential. The breakdown of traditional credit relationships following the Great Default meant that such financing became either unavailable or prohibitively expensive, transforming recoverable setbacks into permanent disasters. The case of Master Geoffrey, the wool merchant, whose partnership with unreliable French associates had led to his confinement, illustrates how the deterioration of international commercial relationships created new categories of risk that previous generations had never needed to consider. His father and grandfather had conducted successful business with French partners based on established networks of trust and mutual obligation that had developed over decades of reliable dealing.
The political tensions and financial instabilities of the late 14th century had undermined these traditional relationships, forcing merchants to work with unfamiliar partners whose reliability could not be assessed through normal means. The stories shared among the imprisoned debtors reveal patterns of commercial failure that reflect broader historical trends rather than individual inadequacies. The prevalence of tales involving disrupted international partnerships, inadequate credit availability, and political interference with normal commercial operations suggests that debt imprisonment had become a common consequence of attempting to conduct business according to outdated assumptions about political stability and commercial predictability. Men who had followed business practices that would have ensured success in their father's generation found themselves trapped by circumstances that no individual planning or prudence could have anticipated. The seasonal rhythm of debt imprisonment also reflected these broader historical changes. Master William's records show that during his grandfather's era, debt cases typically involved genuine commercial disputes where both parties possessed legitimate grievances that could be resolved through negotiation or legal proceedings. The debtors' prison served primarily as a temporary holding facility while such disputes were resolved, with most prisoners gaining release within weeks or months as commercial relationships were restored or alternative arrangements were negotiated.
The contemporary situation, by contrast, involved systemic financial problems that defied easy resolution through traditional mechanisms. Debtors like yourself faced obligations that had grown beyond any reasonable relationship to the original transactions, while creditors confronted losses that threatened their own survival. The result was a situation where debt imprisonment became a form of financial purgatory, with neither debtors nor creditors possessing clear paths to resolution that would restore normal commercial relationships. The psychological effects of this transformation extended beyond the immediate parties involved in debt relationships to affect the broader merchant community's attitudes toward risk and opportunity. Where previous generations had viewed commercial expansion as a natural path to prosperity, the contemporary generation approached new ventures with caution, born of witnessing too many failures among their peers.
The entrepreneurial optimism that had characterized medieval commerce during its earlier phases gave way to defensive strategies focused on preserving existing positions rather than pursuing growth opportunities. These changing attitudes manifested in the physical appearance of commercial districts throughout England, where the grand houses and elaborate warehouses built during the prosperous decades of the mid-14th century stood increasingly empty or converted to humbler purposes. The ambitious architectural statements that had once proclaimed merchant prosperity now served as reminders of vanished opportunities and changed circumstances. Master Aldrich's former warehouse in Ashby, now used for storing agricultural equipment rather than processing valuable wool, exemplified this broader transformation. The social consequences of widespread commercial failure extended beyond the immediate families affected by debt imprisonment to reshape entire communities that had depended upon merchant prosperity for their own economic welfare. Towns that had grown prosperous through their roles as centers of international trade found themselves forced to adapt to reduced circumstances as their merchant elites disappeared through bankruptcy, emigration, or social decline. The skilled craftsmen, transport workers, and service providers who had benefited from merchant wealth faced their own financial difficulties as their traditional sources of employment disappeared. The transformation of Master Aldrich from prosperous wool merchant to creditor's agent represents a common pattern among those who survived commercial failure but found their social and economic positions permanently altered. His intimate knowledge of wool quality and international trade relationships retained value, but only as an employee rather than an independent entrepreneur. The shift from principal to agent reflected broader changes in commercial organization that favored cautious management of existing resources over ambitious pursuit of new opportunities. The institutional responses to widespread commercial failure also reflected the inadequacy of medieval legal and financial systems to address the scale and complexity of the problems that had emerged. Traditional mechanisms for resolving debt disputes had been designed for a world where most commercial relationships were local, personal, and relatively simple. The international scope and financial complexity of late 14th century commerce required institutional innovations that medieval society was poorly equipped to develop or implement.
The correspondence between English and continental authorities regarding the resolution of international debt disputes reveals the limitations of medieval diplomatic and legal frameworks when confronted with financial problems that crossed national boundaries. The lack of standardized legal procedures, currency systems, and enforcement mechanisms meant that creditors and debtors involved in international disputes often found themselves trapped in legal limbo that could persist for years without resolution. The human cost of these institutional inadequacies manifested in the extended imprisonments of debtors whose cases involved complex international elements that defied resolution through existing legal mechanisms. The role of religious institutions in debt relationships also evolved during this period in ways that reflected broader changes in the relationship between spiritual and temporal authority. Traditional church teachings about usury and the moral obligations of creditors and debtors had developed during an era when most debt relationships were simple, local arrangements between individuals who shared common social and religious frameworks. The complexity and scale of late 14th century commercial debt challenged these traditional teachings, creating theological and practical problems that religious authorities struggled to address effectively. The visits to the debtor's prison by local clergy revealed the difficulties that religious institutions faced in providing meaningful guidance to men whose circumstances exceeded the scope of traditional moral teachings.
While priests could offer spiritual comfort and general exhortations to patience and faith, they lacked practical knowledge of commercial law and financial arrangements necessary to provide useful advice about resolving specific debt problems. The resulting sense of spiritual as well as material abandonment added another layer to the psychological burden borne by imprisoned debtors. As winter settles more deeply over the prison, and the short days limit outdoor activities to brief periods in the courtyard, the conversations among debtors increasingly turn to speculation about the future direction of commercial and financial relationships. Some express hope that the current difficulties represent temporary disruptions that will eventually give way to restored stability and prosperity. Others argue that fundamental changes in the nature of political authority and international relationships have permanently altered the environment in which commercial activity must operate.
The debate reflects broader questions about the relationship between individual agency and historical forces that extend far beyond the immediate concerns of debt imprisonment. The men confined within these walls represent the human cost of historical transitions that they neither caused nor controlled, yet their individual choices and circumstances have determined their particular responses to broader changes. Their stories illuminate the complex ways in which personal decisions intersect with historical currents to create the specific circumstances that define individual destinies. As the winter solstice approaches and the days reach their shortest duration, bringing an almost perpetual twilight to the stone chambers of the debtor's prison, an unexpected discovery transforms the quiet routine of your confinement into something approaching scholarly investigation. Brother Marcus, a Benedictine monk who serves as the prison's chaplain and record keeper, has been conducting a systematic review of the institution's archives when he uncovers a collection of documents that had been sealed and forgotten for nearly 2 centuries. The discovery opens a window into medieval debt practices that challenges many assumptions about how such relationships operated in the distant past. The sealed documents found within a wooden chest hidden behind a false wall in the prison's administrative chambers represent the most complete collection of medieval debt instruments and legal proceedings ever discovered in a single location. Brother Marcus, whose scholarly training at Oxford has prepared him to recognize the historical significance of such materials, approaches their examination with the methodical care of a natural philosopher investigating the secrets of the physical world. His gentle manner and obvious excitement about the discovery create an atmosphere of intellectual curiosity that temporarily transcends the grim realities of debt imprisonment. The collection spans nearly a century, from the 1290s through the 1380s, documenting debt relationships that operated according to legal principles and social customs that had largely disappeared by your own time. The earliest documents, written in the formal Latin script used for important legal proceedings, describe debt arrangements that possessed a ritualistic quality almost resembling religious ceremonies.
Creditors and debtors participated in elaborate procedures that invoked divine witness to their agreements, while community representatives served as formal witnesses whose presence transformed private financial arrangements into public obligations. Brother Marcus explains that these ritual elements reflected medieval understanding of debt as fundamentally different from simple commercial exchange. While modern debt relationships focus primarily on the transfer of monetary value, medieval obligations encompassed moral, social, and spiritual dimensions that connected individual financial arrangements to broader concepts of honor, loyalty, and divine justice. The documents reveal that failure to honor debt obligations was understood not merely as breach of contract, but as violation of sacred oaths that carried consequences extending beyond temporal punishment to include spiritual damnation. The physical characteristics of the debt instruments themselves provide evidence of the elaborate care devoted to creating permanent records of financial obligations. Many documents were written on specially prepared vellum, using inks that incorporated precious metals designed to prevent forgery or alteration. Seals pressed into colored wax bore intricate designs that served not only as authentication, but as artistic expressions of the party's social status and religious devotion. The overall effect was to create documents that possessed ceremonial significance comparable to religious relics or royal charters. One particularly intriguing document, dated 1312, describes a debt arrangement that incorporated elements completely absent from contemporary practice. The creditor, Master Hugh de Beverley, had loaned money to facilitate the purchase of a mill wheel, but the agreement included provisions for the debtor's eldest son to serve as the creditor's apprentice for 7 years if the monetary obligation could not be satisfied within the specified time frame. The arrangement created multiple layers of obligation that bound families together across generations while providing practical training opportunities that benefited both parties regardless of the financial outcome. The apprenticeship provisions reveal sophisticated understanding of human capital as a form of collateral that could provide value even when monetary repayment proved impossible. The documents specify not only the duration and conditions of service, but also the skills that the apprentice would acquire, the accommodations that would be provided, and the responsibilities that both families would assume for the young man's moral and spiritual development. The arrangement created bonds between families that extended far beyond simple financial relationships to encompass social connections that might prove valuable for generations. Brother Marcus's investigation reveals that such multi-generational debt arrangements were common during the early 14th century, reflecting a society where individual identity was closely tied to family lineage and community membership. Debt relationships served not only to facilitate immediate economic needs, but also to create social networks that provided security and opportunity in an uncertain world. The documents describe marriages arranged to consolidate debt obligations, business partnerships formed to share financial risks, and community support systems that protected members against the consequences of individual financial failure. The evolution of debt instruments over the century covered by the collection demonstrates gradual movement away from these complex social arrangements toward simpler monetary relationships. Documents from the 1350s and 1360s show increasing emphasis on interest rates, collateral valuation, and legal enforcement mechanisms, while reducing attention to the social and spiritual dimensions that had characterized earlier agreements. The transformation reflects broader changes in medieval society as commercial relationships became more specialized and impersonal. The most mysterious aspect of the discovered collection involves a series of documents that appear to describe debt obligations that were deliberately forgiven or canceled according to principles that defy easy explanation. These mercy bonds, as Brother Marcus terms them, document situations where creditors formally released debtors from obligations despite receiving no apparent compensation. The circumstances surrounding these cancellations suggest the operation of social or religious principles that prioritized community welfare over individual financial gain. One mercy bond from 1347 describes the cancellation of substantial debts owed by multiple families in a Yorkshire village following an outbreak of sheep murrain that had destroyed the local wool industry.
The creditor, Master Robert de Thirsk, formally forgave debts totaling more than £50, a sum that represented enormous wealth by medieval standards. The document provides no explanation for this extraordinary generosity beyond references to divine mercy and Christian charity, but the implications for understanding medieval economic relationships are profound. Brother Marcus speculates that such mercy bonds reflected a sophisticated understanding of economic relationships that recognized the interconnectedness of individual and community prosperity. Creditors who forgave debts during periods of widespread economic difficulty may have calculated that preserving community economic capacity would prove more valuable in the long term than insisting upon immediate payment that might destroy the debtor's ability to participate in future economic activity. The practice suggests a level of economic sophistication that challenges modern assumptions about medieval financial primitive. The archaeological context of the document's discovery adds another layer of mystery to their interpretation. The wooden chest that contained the papers was concealed behind a false wall that appears to have been constructed during the late 14th century, precisely the period when debt imprisonment was becoming more common and harsher in its application. The concealment suggests that someone wished to preserve evidence of alternative approaches to debt relationships that were falling out of favor as medieval society evolved toward more rigid enforcement of financial obligations. Brother Marcus's examination of the chest itself reveals craftsmanship that indicates considerable expense and care in its construction. The wood appears to be imported oak of exceptional quality, joined using techniques that required master-level carpentry skills. Iron fittings show evidence of decorative work that would have been appropriate for storing valuable religious artifacts or royal documents. The investment in such elaborate storage suggests that the documents were considered extraordinarily valuable, worthy of preservation despite the risks involved in concealing them. The location of the concealment adds further intrigue to the mystery. The false wall was constructed in a section of the prison's administrative quarters that would have been accessible only to senior officials responsible for managing debt cases.
The positioning suggests that someone in authority within the legal system wished to preserve evidence of alternative approaches to debt relationships while continuing to enforce harsher contemporary practices. The concealment may represent a form of institutional conscience, preserving examples of mercy and flexibility for potential future reference. The preservation quality of the documents raises questions about the intentions of those who concealed them. Many papers show evidence of having been treated with preservative substances designed to prevent deterioration over extended periods. Some documents were wrapped in oiled cloth, while others were stored with aromatic herbs that would have discouraged insect damage. The care taken to ensure long-term preservation suggests that the concealment was intended as a deliberate archive rather than temporary hiding. Brother Marcus's scholarly analysis reveals linguistic patterns in the documents that provide clues about their original purposes and the motivations of those who preserved them. Many documents include marginal notes written in vernacular English rather than the formal Latin of the main text. These annotations appear to be commentary by later readers who are analyzing the documents for practical or theoretical purposes. Some notes compare medieval practices with contemporary approaches, while others speculate about the effectiveness of different debt resolution strategies. The marginal commentary suggests that the documents served as reference materials for legal scholars or administrators who are wrestling with practical problems of debt enforcement and resolution. The annotations reveal familiarity with both historical practices and contemporary challenges, indicating that the documents were studied by individuals who possessed sophisticated understanding of legal and economic principles. The scholarly nature of the commentary adds weight to Brother Marcus's hypothesis that the concealment represented a deliberate effort to preserve alternative approaches for future consideration. The mystery deepens with the discovery of several documents that appear to be copies rather than originals, suggesting that someone had undertaken systematic efforts to preserve important examples of medieval debt practices. The copying was performed by skilled scribes using high-quality materials, indicating substantial investment in the preservation project.
Some copies include modifications and corrections that suggest they were being adapted for instructional purposes, perhaps for training legal clerks or administrators in alternative approaches to debt resolution. The most puzzling documents in the collection describe debt relationships that operated according to seasonal cycles aligned with agricultural and religious calendars. These harvest bonds specified that debt obligations would automatically adjust based on crop yields, weather conditions, and religious feast days, creating flexible arrangements that accommodated the natural rhythms of medieval economic life. The sophisticated mathematical calculations required to manage such variable obligations challenge assumptions about medieval computational capabilities. Brother Marcus explains that the mathematical complexity of harvest bonds required advanced understanding of probability, risk assessment, and counter systems that exceeded the typical education of medieval merchants or administrators. The existence of such sophisticated financial instruments suggests the involvement of learned clerks possibly trained in monastery schools where mathematical education reached levels comparable to university instruction. The documents provide evidence of intellectual capabilities that have been largely overlooked in modern understanding of medieval economic sophistication. The seasonal adjustment mechanisms described in harvest bonds reveal understanding of economic principles that would not be formally articulated by academic economists for several centuries. The documents describe automatic debt forgiveness triggered by specified weather conditions, graduated payment scales based on agricultural productivity, and community pooling arrangements that distributed risk across multiple families. These innovations demonstrate practical application of concepts that modern economic theory treats as recent developments. As Brother Marcus concludes his initial examination of the mysterious document collection and begins the careful work of transcription and translation that will make their contents accessible to broader scholarly inquiry, the implications of the discovery continue to resonate throughout the debtor's prison. The revelation that alternative approaches to debt relationships had once operated successfully challenges the assumptions that justify contemporary harsh enforcement practices, while the mysterious circumstances of their concealment raise questions about the motivations and methods of those who shaped legal and economic institutions.
The winter solstice brings with it an unexpected visitor to the debtor's prison, one whose presence illuminates cultural dimensions of debt imprisonment that had remained hidden in the shadows of legal and economic analysis. Dame Marguerite de Clare, a noblewoman whose scholarly interest had led her to study medieval legal customs throughout the realm, arrived seeking access to Brother Marcus's discovered documents as part of her broader investigation into the ritualistic elements that had once characterized debt relationships. Her arrival coincides with the prison's observance of certain traditional ceremonies that reveal the persistence of ancient customs even within the harsh realities of contemporary imprisonment. Dame Marguerite's interest in medieval debt rituals stems from her recognition that financial obligations had once been embedded within elaborate ceremonial frameworks that connected individual economic relationships to broader cosmic and social orders. Her investigations throughout England and the continent have revealed traces of death ceremonies that possessed characteristics more reminiscent of religious sacraments than commercial transactions, suggesting that medieval society understood financial obligations as participating in sacred rather than merely secular relationships. The first evidence of these ceremonial elements appears in the physical arrangement of the debtor's prison itself, whose architecture incorporates symbolic features that speak to functions extending beyond mere confinement. The main hall, where prisoners gather for meals, contains carved stone reliefs that depict scenes of judgment, redemption, and release that parallel religious iconography found in cathedral and monastery settings. The positioning of these carvings suggests that they were intended to provide spiritual as well as aesthetic guidance for those contemplating their obligations and seeking pathways to freedom. Dame Marguerite's trained eye identifies specific symbols within the stone carvings that connect to ancient traditions of debt bondage and release that predate Christian influences on English law. Celtic spirals carved into door lintels represent cycles of obligation and satisfaction that mirror seasonal agricultural patterns, while runic inscriptions hidden within decorative borders invoke Germanic legal traditions that recognize debt relationships as forms of temporary kinship between creditors and debtors.
The synthesis of these diverse cultural elements suggests that medieval debt practices drew upon multiple ancient traditions rather than representing innovations of Christian commercial law. The timing of Dame Marguerite's visit allows her to observe the prison's observance of the winter solstice, when traditional ceremonies provide opportunities for debt forgiveness and the symbolic cleansing of financial obligations. These observances, while reduced in scope from their medieval predecessors, retain elements that illuminate the ritualistic framework within which debt relationships once operated. The ceremonies begin before dawn on the shortest day, when the darkness symbolically represents the spiritual condition of those bound by unpaid obligations. The solstice ceremony commences with the gathering of all debtors in the main hall, where they arrange themselves according to protocols that reflect the nature and duration of their obligations, rather than their social status outside the prison. Those imprisoned for the longest periods occupied positions closest to the hall's eastern wall, where the first light of dawn will eventually penetrate the narrow windows. Recent arrivals station themselves toward the western end, symbolically representing their greater distance from the illumination that represents release from bondage. Brother Marcus presides over the ceremony in his role as chaplain, but his invocations incorporate elements that extend far beyond Christian liturgy to encompass older traditions that recognize debt as a form of spiritual as well as material bondage. The prayers he offers invoke not only divine mercy for the imprisoned debtors, but also the ancient concept of seasonal renewal that allows for the periodic cleansing of accumulated obligations. The language he employs draws upon Latin formulations that echo pre-Christian Roman practices of debt jubilee and Germanic traditions of ritual satisfaction. Dame Marguerite observes with particular interest the moment when Brother Marcus reads aloud the names of debtors who have died within the prison during the preceding year, a practice that serves multiple symbolic functions within the ceremonial framework. The recitation of names acknowledges that death represents the ultimate form of debt satisfaction, releasing both debtors and creditors from obligations that can no longer be fulfilled through earthly means.
The ceremony transforms individual mortality into communal recognition of the limits of human obligation and the ultimate authority of divine rather than temporal justice. The symbolic lighting of candles during the ceremony provides another layer of meaning that connects individual debt relationships to broader cosmic patterns. Each debtor lights a candle from a common flame maintained throughout the year in the prison's chapel, representing the shared nature of financial bondage while acknowledging individual responsibility for specific obligations. The gradual illumination of the hall symbolizes the possibility of spiritual enlightenment that can emerge from the contemplation of obligation and the pursuit of satisfaction through righteous means. Dame Marguerite's scholarly analysis reveals that the candle-lighting ritual preserves elements of ancient fire ceremonies that once marked seasonal transitions throughout Northern Europe. The use of specific types of wax, prepared according to traditional methods that incorporate herbs and oils associated with purification and renewal, demonstrates the persistence of pre-Christian magical practices within the framework of Christian ceremony. The symbolic significance of light emerging from darkness connects individual experiences of debt imprisonment to universal patterns of death and rebirth that transcend specific religious traditions. The discovery of Brother Marcus's hidden documents adds new dimensions to Dame Marguerite's understanding of medieval debt ceremonies, as several papers describe elaborate rituals that accompany the creation and resolution of financial obligations. One particularly detailed account from 1334 describes a debt creation ceremony that required 3 days of preparation and involved the participation of multiple families and community representatives. The debtor underwent ritual purification through fasting and prayer, while the creditor performed charitable acts designed to demonstrate worthiness to receive sacred trust. The debt creation ceremony described in the medieval document included the exchange of symbolic objects that represented the spiritual as well as material dimensions of the obligation being undertaken. The debtor presented a ring or other personal ornament to the creditor, symbolizing the surrender of individual autonomy in exchange for material assistance.
The creditor, in turn, provided the debtor with a token that represented protection and guidance during the period of obligation, acknowledging responsibility for the debtor's spiritual as well as physical welfare. Dame Marguerite explains that the ceremonial exchanges created relationships that resembled feudal bonds of loyalty and protection more than simple commercial transactions. The objects exchanged served as permanent reminders of mutual obligations that extended beyond monetary repayment to encompass moral and spiritual responsibilities. The preservation of such tokens in family collections throughout England suggests that debt relationships were understood as creating lasting connections between families that might influence social relationships for generations. The resolution of debt obligations according to medieval ceremonial practices involved equally elaborate rituals that transformed financial satisfaction into occasions for community celebration and spiritual renewal. The documents describe release feasts, where successful debt repayment was marked by communal meals that included both debtor and creditor families, along with community representatives who had witnessed the original obligation. These celebrations served not only to mark the completion of financial obligations, but also to reintegrate formerly indebted individuals into full community membership. The symbolic elements of release ceremonies reveal sophisticated understanding of the psychological and social dimensions of debt relationships that extended far beyond simple monetary exchange. The ritual burning of debt documents, performed in the presence of community witnesses, symbolically destroyed not only the legal evidence of obligation, but also the spiritual bonds that connected debtor and creditor during the period of indebtedness. The destruction ceremony was followed by blessing rituals designed to cleanse both parties of any residual spiritual contamination that might result from their temporary relationship of inequality. Dame Marguerite's investigation reveals that the elaborate ceremonial framework surrounding medieval debt relationships serve practical as well as symbolic functions within communities that lacked sophisticated legal institutions for managing complex financial arrangements. The public nature of debt ceremonies created community awareness of individual obligations that provided informal enforcement mechanisms while also generating social pressure for fair treatment of debtors.
The involvement of community representatives in both creation and resolution ceremonies ensured that debt relationships operated within accepted social boundaries, rather than becoming purely private arrangements between individuals. The seasonal timing of many debt ceremonies reflected agricultural rhythms that governed medieval economic life while also connecting financial obligations to natural cycles of growth, harvest, and renewal. Spring debt ceremonies coincided with planting seasons when borrowing was most necessary for agricultural operations, while autumn ceremonies marked harvest periods when repayment became possible through crop sales. Winter ceremonies, like the solstice observance, provided opportunities for debt forgiveness that acknowledged the hardships imposed by the season's reduced economic activity. The integration of debt ceremonies with religious calendar observances reveals the extent to which medieval society understood financial relationships as participating in sacred rather than purely secular domains. Major debt forgiveness ceremonies often coincided with important Christian feast days, particularly those associated with themes of redemption and divine mercy. The timing suggests that medieval communities understood debt satisfaction as a form of spiritual practice that could contribute to individual salvation and community sanctification. Dame Marguerite's scholarly analysis identifies specific linguistic patterns within medieval debt documents that reveal the ceremonial origins of legal language still used in contemporary debt proceedings. Latin phrases that appear in modern debt instruments preserve traces of ritual invocations that once called upon divine witness to financial agreements, while technical terms for various types of collateral derive from ceremonial objects that possess symbolic as well as material value. The persistence of these linguistic elements suggests the continued influence of ancient ceremonial traditions, despite the apparent secularization of contemporary debt relationships. The architectural features of medieval courthouses and administrative buildings provide additional evidence of the ceremonial context within which debt relationships once operated. Dame Marguerite's investigations throughout England have revealed consistent patterns of symbolic decoration that connected legal proceedings to cosmic and seasonal cycles.
Solar and lunar symbols carved into courthouse facades marked the proper timing for different types of legal proceedings, while representations of agricultural implements and seasonal activities reminded participants that human law operated within natural cycles governed by divine authority.
The discovery of ritual objects within the hidden document collection provides tangible evidence of these ceremonial practices described in the medieval papers. Bronze tokens engraved with symbols representing various types of debt relationships, ceremonial seals designed for specific stages of obligation and release, and miniature scales used for symbolic weighing of moral as well as material obligations all suggested sophisticated ceremonial practices that treated debt relationships as sacred drama rather than mere commercial exchange. As Dame Marguerite concludes her initial observations and prepares to return to her estates for deeper study of the discovered materials, her presence has illuminated cultural dimensions of debt imprisonment that extend far beyond the immediate concerns of legal and economic analysis. The revelation that debt relationships once operated within elaborate ceremonial frameworks challenges contemporary assumptions about the purely secular nature of financial obligations, while suggesting alternative approaches to debt resolution that honored both practical and spiritual needs of human communities. The departure of Dame Marguerite leaves behind an atmosphere of heightened curiosity about the hidden aspects of medieval debt relationships, curiosity that intensifies when Brother Marcus makes yet another extraordinary discovery within the concealed document collection. Hidden beneath layers of later papers, carefully wrapped in silk cloth that bears the unmistakable marks of monastic craftsmanship, lies a bound codex whose contents appear to represent the systematic compilation of debt laws and customs from across medieval Europe. The existence of such a comprehensive legal treatise, unknown to contemporary scholars and apparently concealed for centuries, raises profound questions about the suppression and preservation of alternative approaches to debt relationships. The Codex, written in multiple hands spanning what appears to be several decades of the 14th century, demonstrates a level of scholarly collaboration that suggests institutional support from learned communities whose identity remains mysterious.
The primary inscription is formal script used for important legal documents, while marginal annotations in various vernacular languages indicate consultation and commentary from scholars from different regions and linguistic traditions. The physical quality of the manuscript, with its carefully prepared vellum pages and elaborate illuminated initials, suggests substantial investment in creating a permanent record of legal knowledge deemed worthy of preservation. Brother Marcus's careful examination reveals that the Codex organizes debt law according to principles fundamentally different from those governing contemporary practice. Rather than emphasizing creditor rights and enforcement mechanisms, the compilation focuses on maintaining social harmony and community stability through flexible approaches to debt resolution that prioritize restoration over punishment. The legal principles described in the Codex treat debt relationships as temporary disruptions of social equilibrium that require careful management to prevent permanent damage to community bonds. The opening section of the Codex presents what appears to be a theoretical framework for understanding debt as a form of social relationship rather than purely economic transaction. Drawing upon Aristotelian concepts of justice and Thomas Aquinas' teachings about the moral dimensions of commercial activity, the treatise argues that debt obligations must be evaluated within broader contexts of social responsibility and spiritual development. The philosophical sophistication of this analysis rivals that found in university legal text, while maintaining practical focus on specific applications to real-world debt situations. The Codex's treatment of debt forgiveness reveals systematic approaches to community-based resolution that operated according to carefully developed protocols rather than arbitrary charity. One section describes elaborate procedures for communal evaluation of debt disputes that involve testimony from multiple community members about the circumstances leading to financial difficulty, the debtor's character and previous conduct, and the potential consequences of various resolution options for community welfare. These procedures ensured that debt forgiveness served genuine social needs rather than merely protecting debtors from the consequences of irresponsible behavior.
The most striking aspect of the Codex's approach to debt relationships involves its detailed provisions for what it terms productive bondage, arrangements where debt obligations were satisfied through labor and service that benefited both individual parties and broader community needs. Unlike the harsh labor requirements of contemporary debt imprisonment, productive bondage was designed to enhance the debtor's skills and social standing while providing valuable services to creditors and communities. The arrangements included specific provisions for education, training, and gradual assumption of increased responsibility that prepared debtors for eventual return to independent economic activity. Brother Marcus discovers that productive bondage arrangements described in the Codex incorporated sophisticated understanding of human psychology and social dynamics that enabled them to function as rehabilitation rather than punishment. Debtors engaged in productive bondage retained significant personal autonomy and received compensation for their labor that gradually reduced their debt obligations while providing means for supporting their families.
The arrangements included regular review procedures that allowed for adjustment based on changing circumstances and demonstrated progress toward debt satisfaction. The Codex's provisions for family involvement in debt relationships reveal understanding of financial obligations as affecting entire kinship networks rather than individuals. Debt arrangements frequently included extended family members as participants rather than merely guarantors, creating support systems that distributed both financial burdens and social responsibilities across multiple households. These arrangements provided practical assistance for debt satisfaction while maintaining family unity and preventing the social isolation that often accompanied individual financial failure. The geographical scope of the legal customs documented in the Codex suggests the existence of networks of scholarly communication that transcended national boundaries and political divisions. References to debt practices in regions spanning from Scandinavia to the Italian peninsula indicate systematic collection and comparison of legal traditions from across medieval Europe. Marginal annotations identify specific sources and cross-references that demonstrate familiarity with legal texts from monasteries, universities, and royal courts throughout the continent. The mystery deepens with Brother Marcus's discovery of encoded sections within the Codex that appear to have been deliberately obscured to prevent casual readers from accessing certain information.
The encoding system, based on substitution ciphers that require knowledge of specific texts to decipher, suggests that some legal knowledge was considered too sensitive or powerful for general distribution. The effort invested in creating and maintaining such elaborate secrecy indicates that the encoded information was considered valuable enough to justify the risks involved in preserving it. Brother Marcus's patient work on deciphering the encoded sections of the Codex reveals legal procedures for debt resolution that operated outside normal ecclesiastical and royal authority structures. These shadow courts apparently functioned according to ancient customary law that predated both Roman legal traditions and Germanic feudal customs, drawing instead upon even older Celtic and pre-Roman legal principles that emphasized restoration and community harmony over individual rights and punishment. The persistence of such alternative legal systems suggests that medieval society was far more diverse and complex than contemporary legal documents typically indicate. The shadow court procedures described in the decoded sections of the Codex operated through networks of wise women and men who possessed traditional knowledge of community customs and conflict resolution techniques. These informal magistrates lacked official authority, but commanded respect based on their understanding of local conditions and their reputation for fair dealing. Their decisions in debt cases frequently involved creative solutions that satisfied the practical needs of all parties while maintaining social relationships that formal legal proceedings might have permanently damaged. The Codex reveals that shadow court proceedings incorporated ritualistic elements that drew upon ancient traditions of sacred judgment and divine intervention in human disputes. Debt cases were often resolved through ordeal-like procedures that allowed supernatural forces to determine appropriate outcomes when human wisdom proved insufficient. These procedures included various forms of divination, symbolic contests between parties, and interpretation of natural signs that provided guidance for debt resolution. The integration of magical and legal practices suggests understanding of debt relationships as participating in cosmic rather than merely human order. Brother Marcus's investigation reveals that the ritualistic elements of shadow court proceedings served practical as well as spiritual functions within communities that lacked access to formal legal institutions.
The dramatic and memorable nature of ritual debt resolution created community awareness of legal decisions while providing symbolic frameworks that helped participants understand and accept outcomes that might otherwise have seemed arbitrary or unfair. The public nature of ritual proceedings also created collective responsibility for enforcing decisions and supporting all parties and honoring their commitments. The Codex's treatment of women's roles in debt relationships revealed sophisticated understanding of gender dynamics that challenges contemporary assumptions about medieval women's legal status. Female members of families affected by debt obligations possess specific rights and responsibilities that were carefully defined and protected through customary law procedures. Women could serve as negotiators in debt disputes, provide alternative forms of satisfaction through domestic or craft services, and in some circumstances assume debt obligations in place of male family members who lacked means for satisfaction. The provisions for female involvement in debt resolution included elaborate protections against exploitation and abuse that recognized women's particular vulnerabilities within medieval social structures. Female debtors could request assignment to female creditors or their households, ensuring appropriate supervision and working conditions. Special provisions protected pregnant women and mothers of young children from debt obligations that might interfere with their family responsibilities. The Codex's attention to gender-specific concerns suggests sophisticated understanding of the social complexities involved in debt relationships. The most mysterious section of the Codex describes debt relationships that operated across generational lines according to principles of inherited obligation and collective family responsibility. These bloodline debts created financial bonds between families that could persist for multiple generations, with specific procedures for transferring obligations to descendants and modifying terms based on changing family circumstances. The concept of inherited debt extended beyond simple financial obligation to encompass social relationships and mutual support systems that bound families together across time. Brother Marcus's analysis reveals that bloodline debt arrangements served important social functions in medieval communities by creating stable long-term relationships between families of different economic classes.
Wealthy families who extended credit to their social inferiors accepted responsibility for their debtors' welfare across generations, while debtor families provided loyal service and support that could prove valuable during political or economic crises. These arrangements created social stability and mutual dependence that helped communities survive periods of external threat or internal conflict. The preservation mechanisms described in the Codex suggest that its creators anticipated the need to conceal and protect alternative legal knowledge during periods when dominant authorities might attempt to suppress competing approaches to debt relationships. The elaborate procedures for creating copies, distributing them to trusted guardians, and maintaining communication networks among holders indicate systematic efforts to preserve legal traditions that were considered valuable despite their unofficial status. The sophistication of these preservation efforts suggests institutional support from organizations that possessed both resources and motivation for maintaining alternative legal knowledge. The final sections of the Codex describe prophetic visions of future debt relationships that demonstrate remarkable prescience about the evolution of medieval financial systems toward harsher and more rigid enforcement mechanisms. The authors apparently anticipated that the flexible and community-oriented approaches they documented would eventually give way to legal systems that prioritized creditor rights over social harmony. Their efforts to preserve alternative approaches reflected hope that future generations might rediscover the wisdom embedded in traditional debt resolution practices. As Brother Marcus carefully returns the Codex to its protective wrappings and secures it within the hidden compartment where Dame Marguerite's investigations had first revealed its existence, the implications of its contents continue to resonate throughout the debtor's prison. The revelation that sophisticated and humane approaches to debt relationships had once operated throughout medieval Europe challenges the assumption that harsh imprisonment represents the natural and inevitable response to financial obligation. The mystery of why such knowledge was concealed and forgotten raises troubling questions about the forces that shaped the development of legal institutions and the motivations of those who determined which approaches to debt relationships would survive and which would disappear into historical obscurity. As the new year of 1401 dawns over the debtor's prison, bringing with it the promise of eventual spring and the hope of renewed economic activity that might facilitate debt resolution, an unexpected event transforms the quiet routine of your confinement into a window through which to observe the vast gulf that separates the experiences of common debtors from those of the noble and wealthy classes who shape the legal and economic systems under which you suffer. Sir Edmund de Montray arrives at the prison not as a debtor, but as a creditor seeking to negotiate with several imprisoned merchants whose obligations to his estate have remained unsatisfied despite months of confinement. Sir Edmund's presence within the stone walls of the debtor's prison creates an atmosphere of tension and curiosity that affects every aspect of daily routine. His richly appointed clothing, made from the finest wool and adorned with silver buttons that gleam in the pale winter light, serves as a stark reminder of the material prosperity that remains forever beyond the reach of those confined within these walls. His retinue of servants and guards, though reduced in number for this particular visit, demonstrates the level of personal service and protection that wealth and noble birth provide against the financial vulnerabilities that have destroyed the lives of common merchants and craftsmen. The negotiations that Sir Edmund conducts with imprisoned debtors reveal the complex dynamics of power and obligation that characterize relationships between social classes in medieval society. Unlike the desperate circumstances that brought you and your fellow prisoners to this place, Sir Edmund's financial relationships operate within networks of mutual obligation and support that provide multiple layers of protection against catastrophic loss. His visits to the prison are merely one element in a comprehensive strategy for managing diverse investments and obligations that span multiple counties and involve hundreds of individual relationships.
Master Geoffrey, the wool merchant whose partnership with unreliable French associates had led to his imprisonment, finds himself facing Sir Edmund across a wooden table in the prison's meeting chamber, where the contrast between their circumstances could hardly be more stark. Geoffrey's clothing, once fine but now worn thin by months of confinement, hangs loosely on his diminished frame, while his hands bear the calluses of prison labor that would have been unthinkable during his days of commercial prosperity. Sir Edmund, by contrast, appears untouched by any physical evidence of economic stress, his well-fed appearance and manicured hands announcing his complete insulation from the material consequences of financial risk. The conversation between Sir Edmund and Master Geoffrey reveals the vast differences in how debt relationships affect individuals of different social standings. Geoffrey's imprisonment represents complete personal catastrophe, the destruction of his business, the impoverishment of his family, and the loss of his social position within the merchant community. Sir Edmund's involvement in the same debt relationship represents merely one element in a complex portfolio of investments and obligations that poses no threat to his fundamental security or social position. The nobleman's ability to absorb financial losses that would devastate common merchants demonstrates the profound inequalities that characterize medieval economic relationships. Sir Edmund's approach to debt collection reveals sophisticated understanding of the economic principles that govern relationships between social classes, while demonstrating the psychological distance that separates noble creditors from their debtors. He speaks of Geoffrey's debt not as a personal obligation between individuals, but as an element in larger economic calculations that must be managed according to principles of efficiency and long-term advantage. The human cost of Geoffrey's imprisonment appears irrelevant to these calculations, treated as an unfortunate but necessary consequence of maintaining the incentive structures that ensure other debtors honor their obligations. The nobleman's perspective on debt imprisonment reflects broader aristocratic attitudes toward the proper relationship between individual suffering and social order that justify harsh treatment of debtors as necessary for maintaining economic stability.
Sir Edmund argues that mercy toward individual debtors would encourage others to default on their obligations, creating cascading effects that would ultimately harm the economic interests of entire communities. From his perspective, the harsh treatment of imprisoned debtors serves the greater good by preserving the reliability of commercial relationships that enable economic activity to continue. The practical mechanisms through which Sir Edmund manages his extensive debt relationships demonstrate the resources and institutional support available to wealthy creditors that remain completely inaccessible to common debtors. His estate employs specialized clerks whose sole responsibility involves tracking and managing debt obligations, maintaining detailed records that enable systematic collection efforts while identifying opportunities for profitable new investments. These clerks possess legal training that allows them to navigate complex court procedures and negotiate favorable terms with debtors who lack similar expertise. Sir Edmund's estate also maintains relationships with regional legal authorities that provide informal influence over debt proceedings that can significantly affect outcomes for both creditors and debtors. The nobleman's social connections within the legal community ensure that his interests receive favorable consideration in court proceedings, while his political influence provides protection against adverse legal developments that might threaten his financial interests. These advantages demonstrate how social position translates into practical legal benefits that create fundamentally different experiences of debt relationships for creditors and debtors. The seasonal patterns of Sir Edmund's debt collection activities reveal sophisticated understanding of economic cycles that enables wealthy creditors to optimize their returns while minimizing risks. His visits to the debtor's prison are timed to coincide with periods when imprisoned merchants are most likely to accept unfavorable settlement terms, either because their families have exhausted resources attempting to secure their release or because approaching seasonal deadlines create pressure for quick resolution. The timing reflects calculated exploitation of debtor desperation rather than concern for individual welfare or community harmony. He alternates between expressions of sympathy for the debtor's circumstances and reminders of their legal vulnerabilities, creating emotional pressure that encourages acceptance of settlement terms that might be rejected under different circumstances. His ability to grant or withhold mercy becomes a tool for extracting maximum value from debt relationships rather than an expression of Christian charity or social responsibility. The contrast between Sir Edmund's comfortable quarters during his visits to the prison and the austere conditions endured by imprisoned debtors provides vivid illustration of how social class determines individual experiences of the same institutional setting. While debtors sleep on straw pallets in crowded dormitories, Sir Edmund enjoys private chambers with comfortable furnishings, adequate heating, and quality food prepared according to his specific preferences. His ability to transform even the harsh environment of a debtor's prison into an acceptable temporary residence demonstrates the power of wealth to insulate individuals from unpleasant circumstances. The information networks available to Sir Edmund provide him with detailed knowledge of regional economic conditions that enable strategic decision-making about debt relationships, while imprisoned debtors remain isolated from such intelligence. His servants and agents maintain regular communication with commercial centers throughout England and the continent, providing updates on market conditions, political developments, and opportunities that might affect the value of various debt obligations. This information advantage allows him to time his collection efforts for maximum effectiveness while identifying debtors whose circumstances have improved enough to enable favorable settlements. Sir Edmund's relationships with other wealthy creditors create opportunities for collaboration and mutual support that are completely unavailable to imprisoned debtors who compete with each other for limited resources and opportunities. Aristocratic creditors regularly exchange information about debtor behavior, coordinate collection strategies to prevent debtors from playing creditors against each other, and provide mutual assistance during complex legal proceedings that require specialized expertise. These collaborative relationships create collective power that overwhelms individual debtors' ability to resist unfavorable terms. The educational background that enables Sir Edmund to understand and manipulate complex debt relationships reflects access to formal and informal learning opportunities that remain completely unavailable to most imprisoned debtors.
His training in Latin provides access to legal documents and scholarly treatises that common merchants cannot read, while his mathematical education enables sophisticated analysis of financial arrangements that exceed the computational abilities of most debtors. His understanding of political and economic theory provides frameworks for analyzing debt relationships that allow strategic planning over time frames that extend far beyond the immediate concerns of imprisoned debtors. Sir Edmund's approach to estate management reveals systematic exploitation of the economic vulnerabilities that create debt relationships while providing insights into the mechanisms that concentrate wealth within aristocratic families across generations. His lending activities target merchants and craftsmen during periods of economic stress when they are most likely to accept unfavorable terms, while his collection strategies are designed to extract maximum value from debt obligations regardless of the human cost to debtors and their families. These practices represent rational economic behavior from his perspective, while creating the conditions that fill debtors' prisons with men whose only crime was trusting in economic arrangements that were designed to benefit creditors at their expense. The conversations that echo through the prison stone corridors following Sir Edmund's departure revealed a profound psychological impact that witnessing aristocratic privilege has upon men whose own lives have been destroyed by financial obligations that for the wealthy represent mere accounting entries and elaborate ledgers of profit and loss. As February's cold winds sweep across the prison courtyard, bringing with them rumors of Sir Edmund's lavish entertainments at his nearby estate, the contrast between aristocratic comfort and debtor suffering becomes a constant source of bitter reflection among those whose confinement continues indefinitely, while their social superiors enjoy lives of uninterrupted luxury. Master Thomas, The baker whose fire-damaged ovens had led to his imprisonment speaks with particular vehemence about the fundamental injustices revealed by Sir Edmund's visit. Thomas had observed the nobleman's casual dismissal of debtor hardships, his clinical calculation of human suffering in terms of economic efficiency, and his complete inability to comprehend the personal catastrophes that his financial policies created for ordinary families.
The baker's words carry the weight of moral outrage that emerges when individuals confront the systematic nature of their oppression rather than attributing their circumstances to personal failure or divine judgment. The educational systems that prepare aristocratic children for lives of privilege while denying similar opportunities to children of merchants and craftsmen reveal another mechanism through which social inequalities perpetuate themselves across generations. Sir Edmund's sons receive instruction in Latin, mathematics, law, and statecraft that prepare them to manage complex financial relationships and navigate political systems that will protect their inherited advantages. Meanwhile, the children of imprisoned debtors face reduced circumstances that limit their educational opportunities and restrict their future economic prospects, ensuring that class distinctions persist regardless of individual merit or potential. The marriage alliances that connect aristocratic families create networks of mutual support and shared interests that provide collective protection against economic and political threats while enabling coordinated exploitation of those who lack similar connections. Sir Edmund's marriage to the daughter of Earl William de Clare brought not only immediate financial benefits in the form of dowry payments, but also ongoing access to political influence and commercial opportunities that would remain forever beyond the reach of merchant families. These marriage networks create aristocratic solidarity that transcends individual interests while systematically excluding those of lower social status from meaningful participation in elite decision-making processes. The household expenditures that maintain aristocratic lifestyles reveal the enormous resources devoted to luxury consumption that could otherwise support productive economic activities or provide relief for those suffering from debt imprisonment. Sir Edmund's estate accounts, glimpsed during his prison visit, document expenditures for silk clothing, imported spices, expensive wines, and elaborate entertainments that exceed the total debt obligations of dozens of imprisoned merchants. The casual waste of resources that could resolve multiple debt cases demonstrates aristocratic indifference to the human cost of their privileged consumption patterns.
Sir Edmund's deer parks and fishing streams cover hundreds of acres that could support agricultural production or provide employment for displaced craftsmen, but instead serve only to provide entertainment for the nobleman and his aristocratic guests. The legal restrictions that protect these recreational areas from economic use by others demonstrate how law serves to maintain aristocratic privilege rather than promote general economic welfare. The legal protections available to aristocratic debtors demonstrate how social status determines individual experiences of financial difficulty, with wealthy families possessing access to legal remedies and institutional support that remain completely unavailable to common merchants and craftsmen. When aristocratic families face financial pressures, they can negotiate extended payment terms, arrange complex refinancing agreements, and obtain legal protections that prevent the seizure of essential properties. The legal system that imprisons common debtors for relatively modest obligations provides elaborate protections for aristocratic property rights that ensure wealthy families retain their fundamental advantages even during periods of financial stress. The political influence that aristocratic creditors exercise over legal institutions reveals how democratic pretenses disguise systems of class-based justice that systematically favor wealthy interests while providing appearance of impartial law enforcement. Sir Edmund's informal relationships with local magistrates, his influence over the selection of legal officials, and his ability to shape legal precedents through strategic litigation create a legal environment that serves aristocratic interests while maintaining the fiction that law provides equal protection for all social classes. The international connections that enable aristocratic families to diversify their economic activities across national boundaries provide security and opportunity unavailable to local merchants, whose businesses remain vulnerable to regional economic disruptions. Sir Edmund's relationships with continental nobility, his investments in international trading ventures, and his access to foreign currency markets create financial flexibility that insulates his family from the local economic conditions that devastate merchants who lack such connections. The cultural narratives that justify aristocratic privilege through claims about natural superiority, divine appointment, and inherited virtue reveal psychological mechanisms that enable wealthy individuals to maintain clear consciences while benefiting from systems that create enormous human suffering.
Sir Edmund's casual assumption that his comfortable circumstances reflect divine favor and personal merit, rather than systematic exploitation of legal and economic structures, demonstrates the capacity for self-deception that enables individuals to participate in oppressive systems while maintaining positive self-concepts.
As the winter days slowly lengthen toward the promise of spring, the imprisoned debtors continue to wrestle with the implications of their exposure to aristocratic privilege and the stark contrasts it reveals between their own circumstances and those of their social superiors. The knowledge that their suffering serves to maintain aristocratic comfort adds psychological torment to the physical hardships of imprisonment, while raising fundamental questions about the justice of social systems that create such enormous disparities in human experience based solely upon accidents of birth and inherited advantage. The arrival of March brings with it an extraordinary development that transforms the debtor's prison from a place of unrelieved misery into an unexpected theater where the vulnerabilities of even the most privileged classes become visible to those who had previously imagined aristocratic invulnerability. Sir Bartholomew de Ashford, younger brother of one of the realm's most powerful earls, arrives at the prison not as a visiting creditor, but as a debtor himself, his presence creating a sensation that reverberates through every stone corridor and wooden chamber of the institution. His imprisonment, while surrounded by circumstances that distinguish it dramatically from those of common debtors, provides unprecedented insight into how social privilege operates even under conditions of apparent disgrace and financial failure. Sir Bartholomew's arrival is preceded by extensive preparations that demonstrate how aristocratic privilege transforms even debt imprisonment into an experience fundamentally different from that endured by merchants and craftsmen. His quarters, specially prepared in the section of the prison typically reserved for visiting officials, include private chambers with glazed windows, a fireplace that provides adequate heating, and furnishings that would be considered luxurious in most noble households.
The contrast with the austere dormitories occupied by common debtors could hardly be more stark, revealing how social status determines individual experiences even within institutions ostensibly designed to treat all debtors according to uniform standards. The circumstances that led to Sir Bartholomew's imprisonment reveal the complex financial relationships that characterize aristocratic society, while demonstrating how even massive wealth can prove inadequate when confronted with the political and economic upheavals that marked the final years of the 14th century. His difficulties stemmed not from the failure of a single business venture or the inability to repay modest loans, but from involvement in international political schemes that required financial commitments on a scale that exceeded even his family's considerable resources. His debts, totaling more than £1,000, represent sums that would require lifetimes for common merchants to accumulate, yet for aristocratic families engaged in high-level political activities, such obligations could emerge within months of ambitious undertakings. The political dimensions of Sir Bartholomew's financial difficulties illustrate how aristocratic debt relationships often encompass diplomatic and military considerations that remain completely foreign to the commercial obligations that destroyed the lives of common merchants. His financial commitments had been made in support of English diplomatic initiatives in France that promised enormous rewards for successful participants, but carried corresponding risks for those whose investments failed to produce anticipated returns. The collapse of these diplomatic ventures left Sir Bartholomew responsible for obligations to continental bankers who possessed both the political influence and financial resources to pursue collection through international legal mechanisms. The legal proceedings that resulted in Sir Bartholomew's imprisonment demonstrate how aristocratic privilege operates within judicial systems that ostensibly provide equal treatment for all debtors, regardless of social status. While the formal legal processes followed established procedures for that collection, the practical implementation of these procedures reflected constant accommodation to Sir Bartholomew's social position and family connections. His arrest was conducted with elaborate courtesy that acknowledged his noble status, while his transportation to the prison involved ceremonial elements that transformed legal compulsion into something approaching voluntary compliance with judicial authority.
The daily routine that governs Sir Bartholomew's imprisonment reveals systematic modifications of standard debtor treatment that ensure aristocratic dignity is preserved even under conditions of apparent disgrace. His meals are prepared by servants brought from his own household rather than by prison staff, ensuring that his food meets aristocratic standards for quality and presentation. His clothing continues to reflect his noble status through the use of fine materials and skilled tailoring that distinguish him from common debtors whose garments bear the unmistakable marks of reduced circumstances and prison wear. The social interactions between Sir Bartholomew and common debtors provide fascinating insights into how class distinctions operate even under conditions where formal hierarchies have supposedly been suspended through shared imprisonment. The aristocrat's conversations with merchants and craftsmen reveal psychological patterns that maintain social distance despite physical proximity, with Sir Bartholomew treating his fellow prisoners as objects of anthropological curiosity rather than individuals whose experiences might offer relevant insights into shared circumstances of financial difficulty. The correspondence that Sir Bartholomew maintains with his family and political associates demonstrates how aristocratic networks provide support systems that remain operational even during periods of apparent disgrace and legal difficulty. His regular communications with influential relatives, powerful allies, and international contacts create opportunities for negotiation and assistance that would be completely unavailable to common debtors, whose imprisonment typically results in social isolation and the severing of important relationships. The volume and sophistication of this correspondence reveal the extent to which aristocratic imprisonment functions as temporary inconvenience rather than permanent catastrophe. The political implications of Sir Bartholomew's imprisonment create opportunities for family influence and intervention that operate completely outside the legal mechanisms available to common debtors. His relatives possess political connections that enable them to influence judicial proceedings, modify legal precedents, and create diplomatic pressures that affect creditor behavior in ways that would be considered corruption if available to common merchants. The integration of political and legal strategies demonstrates how aristocratic privilege operates through institutional relationships that make formal legal equality largely meaningless in practice.
The international dimensions of Sir Bartholomew's debt relationships reveal how aristocratic financial activities operate within networks of mutual obligation and support that transcend national boundaries while remaining completely inaccessible to local merchants whose activities are confined to regional markets. His creditors include continental banking houses, foreign nobility, and international trading companies whose own political and economic interests create incentives for negotiated settlements rather than harsh enforcement of debt obligations. The complexity of these international relationships provides opportunities for creative debt resolution that would be unavailable to common debtors whose obligations involve purely local commercial arrangements. The cultural activities that continue to occupy Sir Bartholomew's time during imprisonment reveal how aristocratic privilege enables the maintenance of intellectual and artistic interest even under conditions of legal confinement. His private chambers accommodate visits from scholars, artists, and writers who provide intellectual stimulation and cultural education that transform imprisonment from punishment into extended scholarly retreat. The contrast with common debtors, whose time is consumed entirely by prison labor and worry about family survival, demonstrates how social privilege determines individual experiences of supposedly universal legal sanctions. The religious dimensions of Sir Bartholomew's imprisonment reveal access to spiritual guidance and ecclesiastical support that reflect aristocratic relationships with church hierarchy rather than the basic pastoral care available to common debtors. His spiritual advisors include high-ranking clergy whose theological sophistication and political influence enabled them to provide not only personal comfort, but also practical assistance in negotiations with creditors and legal authorities. The integration of spiritual and practical support demonstrates how aristocratic privilege operates through religious as well as secular institutions. The seasonal rhythms that affect Sir Bartholomew's imprisonment reveal how aristocratic privilege enables maintenance of traditional lifestyle patterns, even under conditions of legal constraint. His quarters accommodate the celebration of important religious and social observances according to aristocratic customs, while his correspondence ensures continued participation in family and political events that occur beyond prison walls. The ability to maintain social connections and cultural practices demonstrates how aristocratic imprisonment functions as temporary relocation rather than fundamental disruption of established life patterns.
The educational opportunities that Sir Bartholomew pursues during his imprisonment reveal how aristocratic privilege transforms legal punishment into intellectual opportunity, while demonstrating the resources available for personal development among wealthy families. His access to books, scholarly correspondence, and learned conversation enables him to pursue studies in law, theology, and natural philosophy that would enhance his knowledge and social standing upon release. The contrast with common debtors, whose imprisonment provides no educational opportunities and often results in skill deterioration, reveals how class privilege shapes individual responses to shared legal circumstances. The marriage negotiations that continue on Sir Bartholomew's behalf during his imprisonment demonstrate how aristocratic families maintain long-term strategic planning even during periods of apparent crisis and legal difficulty. His relatives pursue matrimonial alliances that would provide both financial resources for debt resolution and political support for future family ambitions, treating his imprisonment as temporary obstacle rather than permanent impediment to aristocratic advancement. The ability to maintain strategic family planning demonstrates how aristocratic privilege operates across temporal dimensions that extend far beyond immediate legal circumstances. As spring approaches and the first hints of warmer weather begin to penetrate the stone walls of the debtor's prison, Sir Bartholomew's presence continues to provide stark illustration of how social privilege shapes individual experiences of debt and legal consequence. His comfortable imprisonment, ongoing family support, and elaborate efforts toward debt resolution stand in dramatic contrast to the harsh conditions, social isolation, and limited prospects that characterize the experiences of common debtors, whose only crime was trusting in economic systems designed to benefit aristocratic interests. The aristocrat's eventual release, which appears increasingly certain as family negotiations with creditors progress toward favorable settlements, will restore him to social position and material comfort, while common debtors remain imprisoned indefinitely for obligations that represent mere fractions of his successfully resolved debts. As you settle into your sleeping pallet on this March evening, 6 months after your first arrival within these stone walls, the accumulated weight of all you have witnessed and learned during your imprisonment settles around you like a familiar but transformed garment.
The simple green debt that brought you here, which once seemed like a catastrophic personal failure requiring individual blame and private shame, now appears as merely one thread in an enormous tapestry of social, economic, and political relationships that stretch far beyond your individual circumstances or personal choices. The stories you have heard, the documents you have seen, and the aristocratic privilege you have witnessed have revealed depths of understanding about medieval debt relationships that few outside these walls could ever comprehend. The changing light that filters through the prison's narrow window speaks to the passage of seasons that have marked your confinement, while simultaneously representing the cyclical nature of the debt relationships that govern medieval society. Just as winter inevitably gives way to spring, the harsh enforcement mechanisms that currently dominate debt proceedings represent only one phase in longer historical cycles that have seen the rise and fall of different approaches to managing financial obligations between individuals and communities. The hidden documents discovered by Brother Marcus and the scholarly investigations conducted by Dame Marguerite have revealed that alternative approaches to debt resolution once flourished within the very legal traditions that now seem to offer only punishment and permanent bondage. The contrast between your own experience and that of Sir Bartholomew de Ashford illuminates the extent to which seemingly universal legal procedures actually create fundamentally different experiences for individuals of different social classes. While formal equality before the law provides convenient fiction for justifying existing institutional arrangements, practical implementation of debt enforcement reveals systematic bias that protects aristocratic privilege while destroying the lives of common merchants and craftsmen whose productive activities actually generate the wealth that supports aristocratic luxury. The nobleman's comfortable imprisonment and inevitable release demonstrate how social privilege creates alternative legal realities that operate parallel to but separate from the harsh enforcement mechanisms applied to common debtors. The international dimensions of debt relationships, as revealed through Master Aldrich's experiences and the Great Default of 1397, demonstrate how individual financial difficulties connect to broader historical currents that extend far beyond local circumstances or personal choices.
Your grain debt, Sir Bartholomew's political obligations, and the royal financial crisis all represent different manifestations of systemic pressures that emerge from the ambitious expansion of commercial and political activities beyond the sustainable limits of existing institutional frameworks. The human cost of these systemic failures appears most clearly in places like this debtor's prison, where individuals bear personal responsibility for collective failures of political and economic leadership. The seasonal rhythms that mark your imprisonment speak to deeper natural cycles that continue to govern human experience despite the artificial constructions of legal and financial institutions. The approach of spring brings with it the possibility of renewal and release that operates according to agricultural and astronomical patterns that predate and will outlast the specific legal arrangements that currently constrain your freedom. The winter solstice ceremony, observed within the prison walls, demonstrates the persistence of ancient wisdom about the relationship between cosmic cycles and human affairs, suggesting that current approaches to debt enforcement violate natural patterns that medieval society once honored more consistently. The gradual accumulation of small daily labors that slowly reduces your debt obligation provides a metaphor for the larger historical processes through which social change emerges from countless individual actions rather than dramatic revolutionary gestures. Each day's work in the prison workshop represents both personal progress toward freedom and participation in economic systems that extend far beyond the immediate circumstances of your confinement. The knowledge that your labor contributes to the maintenance of institutional structures that oppress other debtors creates moral complexity that reflects broader questions about individual responsibility within unjust social systems. The relationships you have formed with fellow debtors during your imprisonment demonstrate the capacity for human solidarity and mutual support that emerges even under conditions designed to promote isolation and competition.
Master William's legal knowledge, Master Thomas's moral courage, and Master Jeffrey's international experience have provided education and emotional support that institutional authorities never intended to offer. These relationships reveal how shared suffering can create bonds of understanding and commitment that transcend the social divisions that separate individuals under normal circumstances.
The prison's physical architecture, with its stone walls and iron gates, provides powerful metaphor for the seemingly permanent and immutable nature of social and economic structures that determine individual destinies. Yet the discovery of hidden documents within these same walls demonstrates that even the most solid-appearing institutions contain spaces for alternative knowledge and competing approaches to fundamental human problems. The false walls that concealed Brother Marcus's codex suggest that resistance to oppressive systems often operates through preservation and transmission of alternative knowledge rather than direct confrontation with established authority. The approaching spring brings with it not only the promise of your eventual release, but also the possibility that knowledge gained during your imprisonment might contribute to broader social changes that could prevent future individuals from experiencing the suffering you have endured. The scholarly investigations initiated by Dame Marguerite, the legal expertise accumulated by Brother Marcus, and the moral insights developed by imprisoned debtors all represent forms of intellectual and spiritual capital that could influence future approaches to debt relationships if circumstances permitted their application. The contrast between the harsh reality of your current circumstances and the comfortable security of your present position as listener suggests that historical knowledge provides both intellectual understanding and emotional comfort for those who seek to comprehend the human experiences of distant times. The safety and prosperity that surround you as you listen to these tales of medieval debt imprisonment represent achievements of social development that emerged through countless struggles by individuals who faced circumstances similar to those described in this narrative. Their sacrifices and sufferings contributed to the gradual evolution of legal, economic, and social institutions that provide greater protection for individual dignity and human welfare. The persistence of debt relationships throughout human history, from ancient times through medieval experiences to contemporary circumstances, speaks to fundamental tensions between individual needs and collective resources that no society has ever perfectly resolved. The specific legal and institutional arrangements that govern medieval debt imprisonment represent merely one historical attempt to balance competing demands for commercial reliability, social stability, and individual justice.
Contemporary approaches to debt relationships, while generally more humane than medieval precedents, continue to reflect similar tensions and contradictions that require ongoing attention and periodic reform. As you drift toward sleep on this March evening, carrying with you the accumulated weight of all you have learned about medieval debt imprisonment and the broader historical forces that shaped individual destinies, the approaching dawn represents both personal hope for eventual freedom and broader possibility for social progress that honors both practical necessities and human dignity. The knowledge that previous generations faced similar challenges and developed alternative approaches to seemingly intractable problems provides foundation for optimism about humanity's capacity for learning, growth, and moral development across the long arc of historical time. Rest now, secure in the understanding that individual suffering, when witnessed and remembered with appropriate attention and compassion, contributes to the gradual expansion of human wisdom and the slow improvement of social institutions that serve all members of human communities.